Welcome to Sleep Story History, where sleep is woven with ancient stories, whispered in the dim moonlight of time. Tonight, we will begin a gentle journey through thousands of years of history. Close your eyes, relax your mind, and let this voice take you back to a lost age, where two great rivers flowed through fertile land, where stone cities touched the sky, and where kings spoke to the gods. This is the story of Assyria, an empire that once made the ancient world tremble, and now only a whisper in the dust. On quiet nights, when the wind blows gently through the window and the moonlight falls obliquely on the pillow, do you ever wonder, where did we come from? How many civilizations have been lost before we had a chance to name them? Assyria is one of those whispers, a glorious empire, now reduced to broken bricks, faded reliefs under the dust of time. You are standing in a wasteland where the desert touches the horizon. The wind carries the scent of baked earth, burnt grass, and something distant, like the whispers of the ancients. An ancient stone path leads you deep into the memory. On both sides of the road, there are broken stone statues, tilted pillars, and the remains of a city that was once the center of the world. That is Ashur, the place where it all began. Turn back time. About 4,000 years ago, when Egypt was still building the first pyramids, in the land of northern Mesopotamia, now modern Iraq, the first Assyrians laid the foundations of their civilization. This land is located between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the soil is so fertile that people call it the land of the gods. Imagine the world's first morning. The sun rising over the Tigris, the reeds shrouded in mist, and birds singing across the empty land. Small tribes scattered across the valley, hunting, gathering, and gradually learning to farm. No one knows for sure who the first Assyrians were. There are no written records, no founding date, only the remains and artifacts, pottery, marks on rocks, a shard of a jar, tell that they were there. The city of Ashur was not a magnificent metropolis from the start. Initially, it was just a small riverside meeting place, a place for traders to pass by, a place for people to stop, and a place to worship a god of the same name, Ashur, the guardian god who would later become the symbol of the entire empire. In the first centuries, the Assyrians lived like children of the earth, in harmony with nature, respecting the gods, and trying to survive among the powerful empires around them, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. In the hearts of Assyria, Ashur was more than just a god. He was the vast sky, the great warrior, the guide of the people in battle and in harvest. It was believed that every star in the sky was a whisper from the ancestors, and every strong wind was a sign from the gods. The Assyrians did not fear death. They believed in the cycle of time, that the soul would return, and that fallen warriors would be welcomed by Ashur in heaven. And now, traveler, you are at the threshold of a great story, where every brick carries a memory, every river is stained with blood, and every king carries the dream of a people. We will travel together through 3 stages of the Assyrian Empire. Ancient Assyria, when they were still resilient traders among the great powers. Middle Assyria, when they began to know war, expand their territory. New Assyria, when they became an unstoppable conquering empire. Whether you know it or not, Assyria has fallen. The empire that once ruled the Middle East is now in ruins. But, Like all good dreams, what remains is the echo, and that echo, traveler, will follow you throughout this journey, like a soft melody in your deep sleep. And now, close your eyes. Let the ancient images appear like a dream. You don't need to remember anything. Just let the story guide you. Tonight, you have stepped into the world of Assyria, where history is not just lines in books, but a lulling journey that has lasted for millennia. The land where the Assyrian Empire was founded lies in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia, an ancient stretch of land once known as the cradle of human civilization. Here, the two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, flow parallel to each other across fertile plains and arid highlands. They not only provided life, but also created natural boundaries for peoples, cities, and gods. During the 3rd millennium BC, this land witnessed the rise and fall of primitive cultures, from Sumer to Akkad to Babylon. And within it, in the quiet north, Assyria began to sow its own seeds. The Assyrian land was not as fertile as the land south of Babylon. Rainfall was less plentiful. Rivers were more erratic. The fields were less fertile. But that also created a different kind of people, resilient, adaptable, cautious, and pragmatic. They learned to survive not only by labor, but also by trade and calculation. They built stopping points for travelers, trading centers along the important routes from Anatolia to the southern plains. And on the ancient land on the banks of the Tigris, the city of Ashur gradually took shape. Unlike the southern cities that were often tied to the Euphrates, the Assyrians were closely tied to the Tigris, a more violent river, changing its course more frequently and sometimes causing unexpected floods. But that made them not completely dependent on a single irrigation system like the Sumerians. They learned to improvise, not to let nature control them, but to find ways to control and exploit it. They built small dams, simple irrigation canals, and established a highly communal model of survival, something that later became the premise for effective administrative organization as the empire expanded. Geographically, the Assyrian lands were bordered by the Armenian Plateau to the north, the Zagros Mountains to the east, and the Akkadian Plain to the south. This location not only protected them from invasion, but also gave them control over the trade routes that passed through them. The Assyrians understood that power came not only from land, but also from the ability to control the movement of goods, ideas, and people. They became intermediaries between civilizations, learning from Babylon and Sumer, while influencing the peoples to the north and west. The city of Ashur, originally a place of worship, gradually became the center of power. Here, people built temples to Ashur, their supreme god, and small administrative structures. Ashur was more than just a name. It was a symbol of the Assyrian national soul, a god not of the earth, but of the sky, war, and order. Unlike the Babylonian god Marduk, who was the patron of law and fertility, Ashur represented vision, the imposition of will, and the expansion of influence. The founding of Assyria is closely linked to myths, where ancestors are said to have traveled from far away to find this land following the guidance of the gods. Legend has it that a strange star appeared in the sky, guiding the first people to settle on the banks of the Tigris. They brought with them tools, seeds, and oral stories, and when they erected the first stone pillar inscribed with the name Ashur, they not only built a city, but also laid the foundations of an empire. The Assyrian climate has hot, dry summers and cold, snowy winters in the highlands. This harshness made it impossible for the people to live solely on agriculture. They relied on trade, exchanging goods with their neighbors, from the grasslands of central Anatolia to the jungles of the eastern Zagros. They traded copper, tin, turquoise, and later iron, which would radically change the balance of power in the entire Near East. When you look at an ancient map, you can see how the Assyrians chose strategic locations to develop: near water, near trade crossroads, near highlands for defense, but still close enough to the plains for farming. This wisdom kept them standing when the southern kingdoms collapsed one by one due to floods, wars, or internal unrest. While Sumer disintegrated and Akkad declined, Assyria continued to grow, slowly but steadily. The Assyrians were also very good at exploiting nature. They knew how to grow date palms in dry soil, raise sheep for wool on rocky slopes, and build houses from fire-resistant adobe. From those bricks, they not only built cities, but also carved stories, laws, and dreams. The first cuneiform characters carved in Assyria were very mundane: invoices, lists of goods, notes on marriages, and even prayers for the harvest. The Assyrian language was Semitic, closely related to Akkadian, but with distinct regional characteristics. They later developed a dialect of their own, called Akkadian Assyrian, with a more refined spelling and grammar suitable for administrative, military, and religious writing. It was one of the first civilizations to have a complete system of scribal and archival records, allowing them to control information and maintain power from the center to the far regions. The Assyrians recognized very early the role of theocracy and symbolism in consolidating unity. In every major city, there was a central temple dedicated to Ashur, and each king bore the title Chosen One of Ashur. They ruled not only by law, but also by image, with public ceremonies, monuments, and military parades demonstrating the central authority. As the empire expanded, Assyria developed a network of roads connecting its cities. These roads were not only used for military purposes, but also for the transport of wheat, copper, porcelain, and spices. Rest stations were built every 30-40 kilometers, where travelers could rest, change horses, and be guarded by guards. This was one of the precursors to the ancient postal system. In addition, Assyria's geography allowed them to come into contact with many different cultures: the Hittites to the north, Elam to the east, Babylonians and Sumerians to the south, and later Aramaean nomads from the western desert. Each people brought with them their lifestyles, goods, and beliefs, all of which the Assyrians selectively adopted to enrich their own identity. This intermingling created a multi-layered culture, where divine images could be assimilated, where music and architecture blended many styles. And on that culture, an Assyrian national spirit gradually formed, not pure, but full of strength and high adaptability. It was from the geographical foundation, climate, and harsh living environment that the Assyrians learned three important lessons: must unite to survive, must be flexible to survive, and must be strong to not be swallowed up. Those lessons not only helped them survive, but also became the guiding principle for the entire later rise of the Assyrian Empire. In the shimmering twilight of the Tigris, there was a quiet patch of land that few people paid attention to when the great kingdoms of Sumer and Akkad dominated the view. There were no massive walls, no gilded gates. There was only the sound of the wind blowing through the clay, the footsteps of merchants walking along the stone embankments, and the sight of children playing on the riverbank. There, later, would become Ashur, the first city, the first soul, and the name that would define an empire. Ashur was not originally a center of power, but a small town, ideally situated for trade. It was surrounded by low hills and narrow valleys, opening up routes to Anatolia to the northwest and the Zagros highlands to the east. This location made Ashur an important stopover for caravans, carrying goods, news, and legends of distant lands. The town was named after its patron god, Ashur, who later became the supreme deity of the Assyrians. The original temple to Ashur was a small, roofless, mud brick structure with a stone platform in the middle of the courtyard where offerings of grain, oil, and incense were made. But over the generations, the temple grew in size and significance. It became a spiritual center where major decisions were made with the help of the gods. The people of Ashur were not natural warriors. They were merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. But the diversity of their economic life made the community balanced and sustainable. They traded copper and tin from Anatolia, cloth from Babylon, turquoise from Elam, and furs from the north. They knew how to create mutually beneficial relationships, no threats, no invasions, at least in the first centuries. One of the factors that set Ashur apart from its neighbors was the way it organized its society. Although it had no formal king in its early days, Ashur had a council of elders, made up of wealthy merchants, clan leaders, and temple representatives. Together, they made decisions, ran civic life, settled disputes, and organized festivals. A strong sense of community set Ashur apart, a city ruled by reason and consensus, rather than by the sword. However, Ashur was by no means a completely peaceful land. Threats from the nomadic Aramaean peoples, conflicts between Babylon and Elam, and the rise and fall of successive powers in the south always kept the people of Ashur on their toes. They built the first earthen walls, expanded the guard system, and trained young men in the arts of archery, horsemanship, and stone axe fighting. A trading community gradually became a community that knew how to defend itself. Around the 20th century BC, Ashur began to grow significantly. Archaeological evidence shows a major expansion of the city, with walls, markets, food stores, and houses built in a clear planning pattern. Straight streets, perpendicular intersections, and well-arranged residential areas all showed an urban vision unprecedented in the northern lands at that time. One of the biggest turning points was the Ashur establishment of the Karun trading posts in Anatolia. The most prominent of these was Karun Kanesh, a trading settlement located in Hittite territory, where Assyrian traders set up stations, built warehouses, and operated a sophisticated accounting system. Clay tablets recording the commercial activities of Karun Kanesh survive to this day, reflecting Ashur's advanced level of economic organization. Ashurian merchants signed contracts, drew up documents, and sent messages in cuneiform between Ashur and the Karun by messengers on foot or on donkeys. These clay tablets, though small, contained a whole world of prices, risks, rules, and legality. They showed that Ashur was not only a place of production, but also the place where the concept of international business was shaped in human history. During this period, religion in Ashur was raised to a new level. The central temple was renovated, with a brick dome, high pillars, and an expanded sacrificial area. Rituals became more elaborate, with seasonal and annual rites, processions of gods, and animal sacrifices. The temple leaders became a powerful force in political life, contributing to the preparation for the formation of the monarchy later. It is also important to mention Assyrian women in this early period. In many excavated texts, they are recorded as having the right to manage property, sign contracts for purchases, and sometimes even run family businesses in the absence of their husbands. A society that began with equal, albeit limited, participation of both men and women was a more stable social foundation than neighboring kingdoms. Around the 18th century BC, as powers such as Hammurabi's Babylon expanded southward, Ashur was forced to change. It was during this period that the title King of Ashur first appeared. From a council, power gradually shifted to one person, considered the representative of the god Ashur on earth. Although still a religious figure, the king began to have executive power, collecting taxes, raising armies, and making treaties with other kingdoms. The city of Ashur had now become a fortified center, with a system of strong walls, many temples, small palaces, and densely populated residential areas. Bronze workshops, brick kilns, and markets for spices and luxury goods sprang up like mushrooms. The population included a variety of classes: nobles, priests, merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and even slaves who had been caught up in petty conflicts with nomadic tribes. Soon, Ashur began to develop its own legal system. Based on principles from Akkadian and Sumerian law, they created a local code, clearly defining land ownership, penalties for theft, and military service. Officials were trained to judge, record, and enforce the laws. This was a clear sign of a primitive state where power, law, and religion blended to create an efficient operating structure. What made Ashur special during this period was not military might or territorial size, but the tightness of social organization, the practicality of governance, and the ability to maintain stability in the chaotic context of the ancient world. From a trading post, they built an administration. From a community of farmers and merchants, they formed a complex society with classes and rules. It was in these humble beginnings that the first seeds of the imperial spirit began to grow. Ashur taught his descendants that building a glorious future did not require war or conquest, but order, trust, and a name worthy of being remembered. There is a special period in Assyrian history that few modern people remember. Not a time of mighty armies or cities of white stone, but a time of quiet men traveling through the desert on camels, carrying goods, letters, and dreams far beyond the Tigris Valley. It was the period of the old kingdom of Assyria, a period that was not as brilliant as the new kingdom, but played a fundamental role, the place where the economic identity, administrative organization, and diplomatic capacity of the later empire were shaped. And the center of that period, not on the frontier or on the battlefield, was in a single keyword: Karum. After the city of Ashur entered a period of urbanization and the establishment of royal power, Assyria began to expand its influence in an unexpected direction. cross-border trade. Instead of conquest, they established relations. Instead of occupation, they built posts. The Assyrians soon realized that power lay not in weapons alone, but in the flow of precious metals, rare items, and information. Between the 20th and 18th centuries BC, Assyrian merchants embarked on a great economic migration. They set out from Ashur, carrying their goods, tin, woolen cloth, perfumes, and handicrafts, to cross the vast landmass into Anatolia, the land that is now Turkey. The journey was not short. It was hundreds of kilometers long, passing through mountain passes, rivers, and many different cultures. But somehow they got there, and they did not stop there. They built a system of trading settlements called Karum. The word Karum in Akkadian means port or commercial area, but here it was not on the coast, but in the middle of the continent. The Karums were small, self-organized communities built outside the local cities of the Hittites or other indigenous peoples. They had housing, warehouses, markets, and, most importantly, trading offices, where clay tablets recording all economic activity were kept. The most important of these was Karum Kanesh, a trading center so large that it was called the Wall Street of the Bronze Age. In Karum Kanesh, Assyrian merchants were not scattered, but organized into communities with their own laws, courts, postal systems, and even militias. They maintained good relations with the local nobility through political marriages, gold loans, and honorary hostage exchanges. They had no military escorts, no fortified fortresses, but the Assyrians still commanded the respect of the local kingdoms, not because of their brute force, but because their accounting system was too perfect to be ignored. Among the thousands of clay tablets excavated at Kanesh are loan contracts, commercial contracts, price lists, personal letters, and household ledgers. These tablets show that the Assyrians had created one of the earliest systems of organized international trade in human history. A merchant could sign a contract with someone in Ashur, send goods to Karum, and receive payment in another Karum, all meticulously recorded, witnessed, and traceable. And in the midst of it all, there was a very human world. Some tablets record a father telling his son to take care of his health in a foreign land. Some tablets tell of a dispute over the price of wool, while others tell of a theft between merchants, in which the Karum court punished the offender by confiscating his property and banishing him from the community. These small details paint a vivid, authentic picture of an Assyrian diaspora, wise, committed, and eager to expand the world they knew. The kings of Ashur during this period were not famous warriors. They were great administrators. They understood that wealth would bring more lasting power than any military victory. So they invested in a system of trade control, strengthened diplomatic relations with distant city-states, and used trade taxes to enrich the national treasury. Some documents show that at the height of Karum's power, the revenue from taxes on tin and wool accounted for more than half of Ashur's budget, something unheard of in any ancient country. The Hittites were also wary at first, but then they realized the Assyrians had no intention of conquering land, no interference in internal affairs, just wanted to buy and sell and share the profits. This allowed Karum to be protected, developed, and even given special treatment. Some Karum were even exempted from taxes for the first few years to encourage trade. Assyrian traders were thus able to bring back to Ashur products that the natives could not access. rare metals, precious stones from the Caucasus, cedar wood from the mountains, stallions, and even the recipe for refined bronze. This was the period when the Assyrians began to conceive of strategic interests without territory, a concept so advanced that it would be thousands of years before modern empires adopted it. They realized that controlling the flow of goods, information, and beliefs was more important than controlling every inch of land. And they did this not with armies, but with beliefs, with laws, and with wisdom. However, every golden age has its ups and downs. Around the 18th century BC, internal conflicts in Anatolia intensified. Hittite cities began to fight for power, leading to dynastic wars. Karum-Kanesh, because of its central location, was severely affected. Trading posts were sacked, trade routes were cut, and many Assyrian merchants were forced to retreat to Ashur. The fall of Karum did not spell the end of Assyria, but it did force it to change. From an economy based entirely on trade, they moved to a mixed model, a combination of domestic production, control of trade, and military defense. This was the turning point for the Middle Assyrian period, when kings began to build standing armies, strengthen their fortresses, and plan for real expansion. Although Karum-Kanesh no longer exists, what it left behind, from its writing system, administrative model, trading mindset, to foreign culture, became an indispensable part of the DNA of the later Assyrian Empire. They learned that to be a hegemon, one cannot use force alone, but must have the trust of the governed and the cooperation of strangers. The generation of Karum merchants, who had no monuments, no battle songs, were the ones who laid the real foundations for the rich and proud Assyria that followed. They were the ones who carried their dreams on donkeys through the sandstorms in exchange for copper, tin, and a firm place in history. As the winds that blow across the Mesopotamian plains carry the scent of damp earth and the faint call of fallen civilizations, people still whisper of two names that bowed the heads of the ancient world, Akkad and Ur. An empire born from the dreams of Sargon the Great, and a great city-state that rose from the southern plains, that once dominated the Mesopotamian skies with its stepped pyramids and mighty armies. But their glory also cast a shadow over the lands to the north, where the fledgling Assyria was finding its footing. While the city of Ashur was still a humble trading post, the Akkadian Empire had spread from Sumer to the Mediterranean coast. They brought not only swords and laws, but also a language, symbols of power, and a bureaucracy that everyone under their command had to obey. Assyria, then in its infancy, was caught up in the larger current, becoming a vassal state, a small cog in the giant machine that was Akkad. The Assyrians accepted this role, not because they were weak, but because they knew how to bide their time. Under Akkad's rule, they learned to write in a standardized cuneiform script, to keep records according to royal standards, to organize guards, and above all, to observe the strong in preparation for the day when they themselves would become part of the power map. However, no empire lasts forever. As droughts persisted, rivers changed their course, and the loyalties of vassal states began to waver. The Akkadian Empire slowly began to fracture. Its once invincible armies were scattered by internal wars and revolts by the Gutians from the eastern mountains. Assyria, like a small branch that huddles in a storm, does not break, but waits for the storm to pass. After the fall of Akkad around the 22nd century BC, a power vacuum appeared across Mesopotamia, and it was then that the city of Ur rose under the leadership of King Ur-Nammu. The third dynasty of Ur was not just an attempt at revival, but a dream of restoring order. They built great works, implemented the Ur-Nammu Code, one of the earliest written law codes in history, and continued to maintain the centralized order that Akkad had left. For Assyria, this was not all bad news. Although still in the shadow of Ur, they had access to a more stable trade system, safer routes, and a wide market for goods from the north. The kings of Ur took a more lenient approach than those of Akkad, allowing northern regions like Ashur greater autonomy as long as they paid tribute and did not threaten the stability of the region. And then, once again, history repeated itself. After nearly a century of glory, Ur III was weakened by natural disasters, conflicts, and pressure from Amorite tribes. The southern city-state gradually grew tired of maintaining order over a wide area, while distant regions like Assyria grew stronger thanks to self-government. It was then that the Assyrians realized they no longer needed to rely on anyone to survive. During this period, the kings of Ashur began to act more independently. No longer just heads of the city, they called themselves chosen by Ashur, guardians of the northern lands. Agreements with Ur gradually disappeared from the clay tablets. In their place, trade documents, laws, and administrative records bearing the signature of King Ashur appeared. An independent polity was emerging, not through revolt or war, but through persistence and perseverance during the transition period. It was during this period that the Assyrians perfected their system of administration, dividing the region into districts, each with a governor, who was responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining security, and reporting directly to the central government. Each village had a village chief, and the village chief kept a register of people, land, and production. This structure seemed simple at first, but it later became the foundation for the most powerful administrative empire in the ancient world. More remarkably, the Assyrians did not reject what they had learned from Akkad or Ur. They inherited, but did not depend on it. They used the Akkadian script, but developed their own vocabulary. They used the Ur form of contract, but added more stringent terms. They used the ziggurat as a temple, but built it in their own style, simpler, more practical, but more solid. Where the shadow of Akkad once lay, Assyria now walked on its own 2 feet. When Ur fell completely in the early 21st century BC, Assyria was ready. There was no one to rule over them, no one above them to take orders from, no tribute to offer. The Assyrians looked south, where the ruins of Ur were nothing but piles of rubble, and they understood. The time had come for light to rise from the north. And it was from this period that Assyria entered a period of true independence, opening a completely new chapter, where they were no longer in anyone's shadow, but began to write their own story. There are moments in history that are not recorded in battles, not engraved in blood and swords, but appear only in the eyes of a man who saw what his people had never dared to think. For Assyria, that moment came with a name: Ashur-uballit, a king, a strategist, a diplomat, and above all, a dreamer in a time when the ancient world still viewed Assyria as a remote region on the fringes of the light of power. Ashur-uballit, I reigned around 1365 BC, in a context where Assyria had just emerged from the darkness of Ur and Akkad. The Mitanni Empire, a Hurrian power, controlled much of northern Mesopotamia. In the eyes of Mitanni, Assyria was just a vassal state, a buffer zone, an extended arm for trade routes. But to Ashur-uballit, Assyria was much more than that, and he did not come to live in a supporting role. From the very beginning of his reign, Ashur-uballit began to reform. He strengthened the administrative system, appointing new governors not based on birth, but on ability. He created his own guard, recruited from loyal middle-class families, and restructured the military system on a mobile model, emphasizing speed, discipline, and organization. But his most powerful weapon was not the sword, but strategic thinking. Ashur-uballit understood that to survive among the great powers, Assyria needed to be self-reliant. And to be self-reliant, it first had to escape the shackles that were tightening around its neck. For a long time, the Mitanni had used marriage, alliance, and taxation to keep Assyria in check. But by the 14th century BC, the Mitanni Empire began to show signs of decline. The western territories rebelled, the vassal kings became unruly, and the Hittites from Anatolia began to push across the border. It was an opportunity not to be missed. Ashur-uballit did not revolt immediately. He waited. He sent envoys to neighboring kingdoms, seeking information, establishing relationships. He sent letters to the Egyptian pharaoh, a bold diplomatic move, since previously only empires like Babylon or Hittite had dared to do so. In the surviving letters, Ashur-uballit declared himself the true king of Assyria, equal to the kings of the world. It was more than words. It was a political statement. When the Mitanni Empire fell into civil war, Ashur-uballit struck. He led his army to attack the border cities that had been Mitanni's strongholds, annexing them to Assyrian territory and relocating the local people to safer areas. He did not destroy, he built. Not to destroy, but to organize. That was how he won hearts and asserted lasting control. For the first time in centuries, Assyria expanded its territory on its own, not as a lackey of another empire, but as a sovereign kingdom. Clay tablets from this period describe Ashur-uballit as the one chosen by Ashur to awaken the spirit of the north, as the light that rose from Ashur, warming the land that had been forgotten. However, victory did not come easily. After Mitanni's decline, other powers began to set their sights on the fertile land of the north. Babylon, Hittite, even Egyptian. A power play was underway, and Ashur-uballit, though a young king, stepped into the game as a seasoned player. He continued to use diplomacy as a weapon. He married his daughters to Babylonian princes, sent gifts to small city-states to build alliances, and posted priests to the major temples in the region to bind the religion, which had not only spiritual significance, but also a way of building soft influence. On the frontiers, he built small fortresses, but connected them by a system of stations, allowing his army to respond quickly to any situation. A major turning point was when Ashur-uballit declared himself King of the Kingdom of Assyria, the first time in history that title had been used officially. No longer head of Ashur or servant of Ashur, he had placed the entire northern region of Mesopotamia under his name. And that title was recognized by other empires, not out of goodwill, but because they had no other choice. Assyria was independent, not by blood, but by cold strategy and burning desire. And that desire did not stop at the borders. Ashur-uballit began to lay the foundations of an empire. He instituted censuses, organized assessments of agricultural production to collect fair taxes, rebuilt abandoned temples, and especially opened cuneiform schools for the new class of officials. This was a revolutionary step. For the first time, writing and knowledge were not only the domain of the priestly class, but also extended to the middle administrative class. Knowledge, for him, was the basis of lasting power. By the end of his life, Ashur-uballit had expanded Assyria's territory south to the Babylonian threshold, west to the steppe with the Hurrians. He had brought Assyria out of its thousand-year shadow and into the light as a new power. Small but powerful, not yet powerful but not to be underestimated. The ancient world began to write Assyria into the map of equal kingdoms. And it all began with a dream, the dream of a man who dared to think that the city of Ashur would be not just a place of residence, but the heart of an imperial future. Ashur-uballit did not live long enough to see Assyria's zenith, but he planted the seed of an independence that begged no one, a power that borrowed no money, and an ambition that knew no bounds. Kings who came after him, from Tukulti-Ninurta to Tiglath-Pileser, walked the path he paved. A path paved not with precious stones, but with faith in something greater. The dream did not belong to him alone. Now it had become the soul of an entire nation. In the ancient world, where time flowed with the Tigris and Euphrates, there were names that were not just rulers, but symbols of a period of great change, where the dream of expanding power and prosperity collided with the boundaries of divinity, morality, and collapse. And one of the names that shook Mesopotamia in the 13th century BC was Tukulti-Ninurta I, the king who brought Assyria to the heights of power and at the same time touched the sacred limits of the ancient world by touching the heart of the southern civilization, Babylon. After Ashur-uballit, I established Assyria's independence and laid the foundations of a sovereign state. His successors continued to strengthen the military, administrative, and diplomatic systems. Assyria became stronger, more organized, and ready to challenge any power in the region. However, they were always overshadowed by Babylon, not only because Babylon had been the greatest religious and cultural center, but also because the Assyrians themselves had borrowed much from Babylon. Their writing, their architectural style, their legal system, and their religious rituals. In this context, Tukulti-Ninurta, I ascended the throne with a very different mindset. He no longer saw Assyria as a frontier kingdom trying to make its way into the larger world. He believed that Assyria deserved to be the new center of power in Mesopotamia, and he set out to prove it with both military prowess and political vision. From the very beginning of his reign, Tukulti-Ninurta launched major military campaigns against the northeastern lands, defeating the Hurrians, conquering the Zagros Mountains, and controlling the trade routes from Persia to Anatolia. He reformed the army in a new way, using archers, chariots, and dividing the army into distinct roles. Assyrian discipline became legendary. Soldiers were trained in ranks, wore bronze armor, and were able to march for long periods while maintaining precise formation. But Tukulti-Ninurta's greatest, most haunting, and most controversial goal of his life was Babylon, the cultural heart of the south, the seat of the god Marduk, the place that all great dynasties had to pay homage to. Babylon was now in decline under the Kassite dynasty, after years of civil war and conflict with Elam. The opportunity had come, and Tukulti-Ninurta did not miss it. The conquest of Babylon was not a single battle. It was a series of sieges, tactics of attrition, and supply cuts, which he deployed step by step, layer by layer, like a chess game that lasted for years. He attacked not only from the north, but also from the southeast, using temporary alliances with nomadic tribes to create a pincer movement. The Assyrian army entered Babylon like a long, patient snake, not rushing, but tight and ruthless. After months of siege, Babylon fell. Tukulti-Ninurta entered the city amid the frightened eyes of the inhabitants, the ruins of the temple, and the whispers of the priests. But he did not stop there. What he did next, in the eyes of many Mesopotamians, would forever be associated with sacrilege. He plundered the temple of Marduk. At the center of Babylon, the holiest place, was the Esagila, a temple dedicated to Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. For centuries, no matter what wars were fought, kings avoided damaging the Esagila temple, not out of fear of the Babylonian army, but out of fear of the gods themselves. But Tukulti-Ninurta, in a highly symbolic act, ordered the removal of the statue of Marduk and its return to Assyria. The act was a declaration. Assyria was no longer the learned disciple, but the legitimate heir to Mesopotamian power and divinity. In Ashur, he built a new city in that own name, Tukulti-Ninurta, with temples, palaces, and a separate temple dedicated to Marduk. But the Babylonians and many Assyrians loyal to traditional values began to worry. For them, the removal of the statue was a great treason. Marduk did not belong to the north. The imposition of the divine is not just political, but a reversal of the divine order of the world. Reaction came from both within and without. Small kingdoms rebelled against Assyrian rule. Some governors in the south refused to pay tribute. Worse, in Ashur itself, conservative nobles and priests began to openly criticize the king's provocation of the gods. Nevertheless, Tukulti-Ninurta continued his grand projects, strengthening the army, expanding the farming areas, building irrigation systems along the Tigris, and developing new administrative centers. He placed great emphasis on education, encouraged the copying of ancient texts, and founded the Tukulti-Ninurta Library, a precursor to the larger libraries of Ashurbanipal. But the rift within the court could not be healed by works alone. Toward the end of his life, Tukulti-Ninurta was overthrown by his own son in a palace coup. He was imprisoned in the palace, then assassinated in silence, a chilling end to a thunderous reign. His legacy, however, is undeniable. He was the first king in Assyrian history to reach the heart of Babylon, to confront religious restrictions, and to transform Assyria from a regional kingdom into an empire that would dominate Mesopotamia. Tukulti-Ninurta was the embodiment of ambition, a great, determined, but also dangerous ambition. He was not the most popular king, but he paved the way for the development of medieval Assyria, paving the way for later conquests. And though he fell without fanfare, the citadels, the stone walls, the ancient laws and inscriptions still bear his name, like a whisper in the long night. That there was once a man who, in the midst of the divine darkness, dared to raise the torch of secular power and say, "This land no longer belongs to Marduk, it belongs to Ashur." There are periods in history that are defined not by a king, not by a battle, but by something even greater, a state machine, well-oiled, formidable, and without room for error. By its Middle Ages, Assyria was no longer a mere kingdom. It had become a system of mechanized human power, cast in the iron rules and fire of empire. When Tukulti-Ninurta-I fell, it was thought that Assyria would stagnate. But they were wrong. Though he was overthrown, it was his legacy, his administrative stations, his new temple system, his military organization, that paved the way for Assyria to enter an unprecedented period. Middle Assyria. The heart of this period was not a king, but the entire apparatus of government. The Assyrian state system gradually evolved into a highly centralized model of control, where everything, from grain yields to the names of individual soldiers, from the location of guard posts to slave lists, was recorded, stored, and reported. Cuneiform was no longer a tool of the priests, but became a tool of administration. At the top was the king, who was known as the living representative of Ashur on earth. Below him were the regional governors, each of whom governed a region like a small kingdom, but was absolutely responsible to the central government. Each governor had his own army, tax collectors, envoys, and messengers. But all decrees had to be sent back to the center for storage and reconciliation. If they did not match, they could be dismissed or executed immediately. Most remarkable was the surveillance system that Assyria adopted, a kind of internal security in ancient times. Spies, observers, and monitors were sent to the provinces to record any movements, popular discontent, religious strife, unusual troop movements. These reports were sealed with the royal seal and sent by camel express to Ashur. From there, the court could react very quickly, suppressing, relocating, or replacing officials. One thing that set Assyria apart from its contemporaries was its introduction of iron into its system of warfare and manufacturing. While most of the world was still using bronze, Assyria was ahead of the curve. They mined, smelted, and crafted iron weapons, which were cheaper, harder, and easier to produce. This allowed them to equip the entire army, not just the elite, with a uniform set of armor, shields, and weapons. This was the era of tactical units. Groups of soldiers trained to fight in fixed formations, with commanding officers who could flexibly change formations depending on the terrain. For the first time in history, war was no longer a matter of haphazard, emotional attacks, but of discipline, mobility, and coordination. Those who did not adapt to the new way of fighting were crushed. At the same time, the Assyrian state apparatus also adopted periodic statistics, a crude but effective form of census. Local officials had to record the names of all households, crop yields, slaves, livestock, and tools of production. Each year, the figures were compared, and if they fell short of expectations, an explanation was given. This allowed the state to know where its resources were, what needed to be strengthened, and where it could be mobilized for military campaigns. The Assyrians also understood that to maintain their empire, transportation was vital. They expanded the road system throughout the territory, paved main roads with rest stops, warehouses, and even barracks. There was a post station every 40-50 kilometers. Cuneiform letters were sent from the frontier to the center in just a few days, an astonishing speed for an era without motorcycles or telegraphs. But most importantly, what kept the machine going was not roads, iron, or soldiers, but faith in the god Ashur and the sense that the empire was a sacred mission. The Assyrians saw the king not just as a political head, but as an intermediary with the gods. They believed that the prosperity of the kingdom reflected the level of Ashur's pleasure. So everything, from construction to war to sacrifice, was organized as a ritual to please the supreme god. That's why the Middle Assyrian law was extremely strict. Steal grain, cut off your hand, slander the king, execute, falsify tax documents, hang in public. Although harsh, it made the people fear and respect them, and, importantly, everyone knew the law and understood the consequences. There were no privileges for the nobility, no forbidden zones. The king, if he broke the rules of the rituals, could also be questioned by the priests. Under kings such as Arik-den-Ili and Adad-nirari I, Assyria was no longer a frontier kingdom struggling against encroachment. It became a true empire, controlling the entire area from central Mesopotamia to the Armenian plateau. The vassal lands were integrated into the administrative system. If they submitted, they were protected and enjoyed trade. If they resisted, they were razed and resettled. One of the most effective policies was forced migration. Whenever a region rebelled, its inhabitants were sent elsewhere, mixed with other peoples, and their community was broken. At the same time, the Assyrians would send officials, priests, and soldiers to renew power. This was a systematic social restructuring policy, allowing Assyria to maintain power without having to permanently station troops everywhere. This was also a period of marked artistic and architectural development, not in the ornate style of Egypt or Babylon, but in a strong, practical, and powerful way. Palaces were built high, with arches and wide staircases, to facilitate the movement of armies. Monuments were carved with scenes of kings receiving envoys, judging trials, or receiving tribute, as a form of visual propaganda of power. Every detail, from floor tiles to sculptures, served a purpose: to show the empire as invincible. But because it operated like a machine, Middle Assyria was plagued by a simmering tension. Any link that went wrong could lead to crisis. Over-reliance on discipline, too rigid in law, and sometimes cultural inflexibility meant that many vassal states were only superficially subservient, waiting for an opportunity to revolt when the center weakened. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that this period was when Assyria stepped out of the shadow of Babylon, Elam, and the old empires. They were no longer the ones learning from behind, but the ones setting new standards for imperial governance, military force, and organization. They extinguished every doubt with iron, burned every resistance with fire, and held the empire together with an eye on every corner of its territory. Middle Assyria was a time of organized power, not explosive, but latent, not smashing everything, but controlling every detail. And that is what made the empire last longer than anyone could have imagined. The engine was set in motion, and the ancient world, from Elam to the Hittites, from Babylon to Egypt, began to look north, where Assyria was no longer the forgotten, but the new center of power and fear. Every empire has its storms. It is not always the mighty who are defeated by equal opponents. Sometimes It is the whirlwinds from distant lands, without maps, without temples, without courts, that break down a seemingly impregnable system. For Assyria, the storm was called Aramaean. Around the end of the 12th century BC, Assyria was at the height of its power in the Middle Ages. Its administration was tight, its army was skilled, its territory was expanding. But at the same time, ancient civilizations across the Middle East began to enter a period of unprecedented upheaval, what modern historians call the Late Bronze Age crisis. Great empires, such as the Hittites, Mycenaeans, Ugarit, collapsed in just a few decades. The causes could be climate, war, internal strife, or disease. But one factor stood out: the mass and violent migration of semi-nomadic groups. Among them, the Aramaeans, a Semitic people from the Syrian desert, emerged as one of the most powerful and direct threats to Assyria. The Aramaeans were unlike Assyria's traditional enemies. They had no large cities, no castles to besiege, no kings to negotiate with. They were scattered, mobile, and moved with the seasons. When drought struck the western desert, they poured into the northern plains, where Assyria had established a stable agricultural system. At first, it was only small raids. They stole food, captured slaves, and retreated into the forests and hills. But as time went on, the Aramaean groups grew bolder, attacking outposts, cutting off communications, even penetrating deep into the Assyrian administrative center. Some border towns were completely taken over. Post offices were rendered inoperable. Reports from the south said, "The enemy was invisible, uncaptured, but left smoke and blood everywhere he went." The Assyrian kings of this period, from Ashur-nirari III to Enlil-kudurri, tried to fight back, but to no avail. The army, organized on a fixed, disciplined model, suitable for large-scale warfare, proved powerless against an enemy using guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks, rapid withdrawals, and dispersed forces. Worse still, panic spread to the imperial court. Some local governors did not wait for central orders, but negotiated with Aramaean groups to keep their areas peaceful. Some even secretly cooperated, allowing Aramaeans to trade goods for peace. The Assyrian system of control, rigid and centralized, began to crack. In the temples, priests began to speak of the punishment of Ashur, because the king had failed to observe ritual or to rule by virtue. The faith of the people wavered. Some small settlements on the outskirts were abandoned. The once proud state machine began to falter. It was a dark time, a period that chroniclers call the Unknown Age, because historical records are sparse, projects are abandoned, and no major campaigns are recorded. For an empire accustomed to living in the light, retreating into darkness was indescribably painful. But Assyria did not die. In that darkness, they began to learn all over again. Successive kings did not seek to defeat the Aramaeans in the old way, but to adapt. They divided their armies, organized them into rapid response teams, trained their soldiers in mountainous terrain. They sent spies to the markets, where the Aramaeans frequented. They moved from fixed defenses to flexible networks, small mobile outposts, supplied with dried food and equipped with mobile communications. Some Aramaean groups were recruited into the army in exchange for land, citizenship, and social standing. They brought survival skills, navigational skills, and a deep understanding of areas Assyria had never controlled. Gradually, enemies became allies. And the face of the empire began to change, less on stone fortresses and more on adaptive networks of people, beliefs, disciplines. By the 10th century BC, under Ashur II, Assyria began to fight back, not in droves, not with fanfare, but step by step, like an oil slick. They did not take cities. They re-established trade routes, rebuilt post offices, reopened border markets. They did not need land. They needed people. Slowly but surely, Assyria regained its influence. Ashur II also carried out a comprehensive reform of the administrative system. Governors were required to report in greater detail, and recruitment was based on merit, not on family background. The record-keeping system was upgraded. Clay tablets were classified by industry, sector, and region. The central archive was expanded. Reports now not only recorded events, but also analyzed their causes and consequences, a major step forward in humanity's first analytical administration. The Assyrians also learned to accept difference. Instead of assimilating the Aramaeans, they allowed them to coexist, as long as they did not oppose the state. Small Aramaean temples were built next to the Ashur temple. New names appeared in the texts. The Assyrian people were no longer homogeneous. They became an organized whole, where each member had a clearly defined role, rights, and obligations. By the end of this period, Assyria not only recovered, they were stronger than before, and strangely enough, it was the Aramaeans, the ones who had once sown terror, who became the greatest lesson that helped Assyria enter the new empire, a period of unprecedented power. From ruin, they learned to build. From chaos, they learned to control. From enemies, they learned to adapt. And so, from the storm, Assyria emerged, not broken, but head held high, bearing the scars of a people once plunged into panic, and from that very moment, finding a new form, more flexible, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. There are dawns that come not with the song of birds or the bright light of day, but after long nights of darkness, where the ashes still smolder and the gaunt hands still try to rebuild from the ruins. The rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire was one such dawn, an awakening that was not noisy, not initially brilliant, but carried with it a strength that transcends time. Having weathered the Aramaean storm, Assyria entered the 10th century BC with a new face. They were no longer the rigid empire that favored absolute control, but had learned to adapt, to be flexible and adaptable. The population within the empire was no longer pure Assyrian, but a collection of many ethnicities: Akkadian, Aramaean, Hurrian, Babylonian, and Highland tribes. All lived under a unified legal system operated by a central state. The first to usher in this great renaissance was Ashur-nasirpal II, a king who was both a warrior and an empire planner. He understood that to restore Assyria's status, it would necessary not only to fight, but also to rebuild its image, a symbol. And so he chose to rebuild the empire from a new center, a city called Kalhu, Kala Nimrud, which became the new administrative capital of Assyria. At Kalhu, he built a royal palace with vividly carved walls, depicting military victories, royal ceremonies, and images of the king standing majestically among the gods. These reliefs were not just art, but a visual manifesto, designed to spread the image of the dynasty's power to every corner of the empire. The army was reformed in the direction of complete professionalism. No longer relying heavily on seasonal conscripts, Assyria recruited and trained a permanent force, living in barracks year-round, provided with food, weapons, and paid in kind. The military branches were clearly divided: archers, heavy infantry, cavalry, chariots. Each soldier had a role in the tactical formation, trained to fight by command, formation, and reflexes rather than by feeling. One of the breakthrough inventions of this period was the four-wheeled chariot, which was lighter, faster, and carried two men, a driver and an archer. With this corps, Assyria controlled the vast plains, responded quickly to rebellions, and put pressure on the frontiers. Ashur-Nasir-Pal II also reinitiated the tradition of forced migration and systematic assimilation. After each military campaign, he brought tens of thousands of people from the conquered areas, including craftsmen, farmers, and intellectuals, to the center of the empire, settling them in underpopulated areas or near trade routes. This helped to both eliminate the roots of rebellion and provide labor and technology for the center. After him, his son Shalmaneser III continued to expand the empire by campaigning into Syria, Anatolia, and as far as the Taurus Mountains. For 30 years, he was virtually restless. He conducted a military campaign every year. His victories were recorded on stone stelae, erected everywhere, as a public record of the empire, forcing all vassals to respect him. However, Assyria did not rule solely by force. They knew how to use religion, trade, and culture to expand their influence. Temples to Ashur were built in remote areas, but at the same time, they accepted local gods, as long as they did not threaten central domination. They established cross-border trade markets, encouraging the exchange of goods, languages, and techniques. So, although it was a military empire, Neo-Assyria was also a cultural center. Royal libraries began to form, where thousands of ancient cuneiform texts were copied and preserved, not only from Assyria, but also from Babylon, Sumer, and Elam. This was how Assyria not only conquered territory, but also the memory of civilization. Another major highlight was the development of the road network. Stone roads connected Ashur to Kalhu, to Nineveh, and beyond, with rest stops, patrols, and an official postal system. Messengers carrying royal insignia could travel hundreds of kilometers in a few days, a remarkable feat in an age without machines. However, Assyria was not immune to resistance. The Syrian vassal alliances, the Phoenician city-states, and the Zagros mountain tribes frequently revolted. But Assyria no longer dealt with the wholesale massacres of ancient times. It knew how to negotiate, divide its enemies internally, form alliances, and use culture to assimilate. It was an astonishing maturity for an empire that had nearly collapsed because of its rigidity. In the 9th century BC, Assyria entered a period of rare stability. Taxes were collected regularly, the army was constantly trained, and agricultural production expanded with the new irrigation system. Regional governors were no longer feudal nobles, but officials appointed by the court, constantly monitored and required to report periodically. All these elements, from military, administrative, cultural to economic, merged into a complete apparatus of domination. Assyria was no longer a kingdom fighting for survival, but an empire expanding to realize a vision. That vision was no longer about holding the land, but about controlling the system, people, goods, religion, information. And above all, it was a sense that this empire was the will of Ashur, a sacred mission that needed to be protected at all costs. The dawn of the Neo-Assyrian Empire did not come in a flash. It came in silence, step by step, through sweat, blood, and words carved in stone. But it never faded, until the entire Near East trembled under their feet. In the cracked plains of the 8th century BC, where Assyrian cities were losing their luster and loyalties were breaking with each passing tax, a man emerged from the shadows of the imperial court, not with royal blood, but with determination, discipline, and a vision that would change history forever. His name was Tiglath-Pileser III, and he came to do one thing: rebuild the empire from the ground up. By the time he ascended the throne in 745 BC, Assyria was in crisis. Its western provinces were in rebellion. The northern steppes were being ravaged by nomadic tribes. Previous kings were seen as weak, manipulated by the court, and local aristocracies treated their allotted lands as hereditary fiefdoms, neglecting their governance, amassing wealth, and obstructing reform. The Assyrian Empire, though still vast, was slowly hollowing out from within. Tiglath-Pileser did not come to patch things up. He came to operate on the entire system. His first act was to abolish the entire local aristocracy, stripping them of their provincial inheritances. Instead, he divided the entire territory into new administrative provinces, directly appointed by the central government, men loyal to the king, with no land of their own, living only on the royal stipends. He created a system in which all power was concentrated in a single point: the Assyrian throne. He then carried out a great military revolution. Before his time, the Assyrian army had been largely a seasonal service. Peasants were called up at the end of the harvest season, carrying personal weapons and receiving little training. Such armies, though large, were undisciplined, difficult to control, and inflexible. Tiglath-Pileser abolished that model. He created a standing professional army, both Assyrian soldiers and mercenaries with their own barracks, paid by the state, trained year-round, and ready to march at short notice. He also reorganized the army into modern branches: heavily armored infantry used to breach defenses, mobile archers trained in accurate long-range shooting and spread out in formation, two-man cavalry, one rider, one spearman or bowman, light chariots, used to create psychological pressure and break through the front lines. Each unit had its own commander, its own symbols, and was organized according to a regional command. This meant that if the eastern frontier was attacked, the troops there could respond immediately without having to ask for orders from the center. An integral part of the reform was logistics. Tiglath-Pileser reorganized the routes, establishing granaries, supply stations, forges, and stations throughout Assyria and its vassal territories. This allowed him to sustain long campaigns at great distances without exhausting the center. Through his radical reforms, Tiglath-Pileser began to expand the empire exponentially. Within the first few years of his reign, he defeated the vassal confederacy in Syria, capturing powerful cities such as Arpad, Damascus, and Hamath. He then advanced on Babylon, bringing Assyrian government into the southern cultural center, not by destruction, but by royal marriage and administrative assimilation. One of his most daring moves was to change the way Assyrians annexed territory. Previously, Assyria had allowed local kings to rule after conquest, only demanding taxes. Tiglath-Pileser did not. He annexed them directly into provinces of the empire, appointed governors, changed the administrative language, built temples to Ashur, making each piece of land he conquered a part of the Assyrian entity. That is, Assyria did not just expand its territory, it expanded itself. He also had his name engraved on hundreds of buildings, temples, and reliefs, not for show, but to shape the image of the divine warrior king. Every victory, every resettlement, every new city had his face, either on the walls or in the name. The image of Tiglath-Pileser was everywhere, becoming a unified model of the power, order, and sacred mission of the empire. Also under him, for the first time in the history of the Near East, Assyria controlled the entire region of Mesopotamia, Syria, and the Iranian plateau, from the Mediterranean to Persia, a huge space, connected by roads, mail, armies, and unified laws. Yet, strangely, despite his military prowess, the number of total massacres under his rule was very small. Tiglath-Pileser did not want to burn everything down. He wanted to seize it, restructure it, and use it for the empire. So many vassal states surrendered without a fight, because they knew that being a vassal of Tiglath-Pileser meant having roads, having trade, having security, as long as they obeyed. And so, in the space of a decade, Tiglath-Pileser III conquered not just land, but the idea of empire. He changed the very concept of dominion, not standing above it, but connecting it all into one inseparable system. By the time of his death, Assyria was not only the greatest power, but a fully formed super-empire, ready to enter its greatest period under successors such as Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and especially Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal. But all of it stood on the foundations that Tiglath-Pileser III had built with sweat, blood, and will. He was no divine king, nor was he a prophet. He was a man who saw clearly the decay of an empire and had the courage to tear it down and rebuild it. The entire ancient world, from the Mediterranean to Persia, would change at his command. And history, as usual, has carved his name, not with a crown, but with the boundaries of the empire he opened with sword, reason, and vision. Not all empire builders are born into glory. Some ascend to the throne amid skepticism, controversy, and the curse of the old order. But it is those who, with determination and a vision beyond their time, can build something beyond the boundaries of the map. An empire without borders, as Sargon II did. Sargon II ascended the throne in 722 BC, at a sensitive time. His predecessor, Shalmaneser V, had mysteriously disappeared, there was no clear successor, and the court was in disarray. Sargon was not the son of Tiglath-Pileser III, nor was he the designated successor. His origins were shrouded in political fog. But one thing was clear: he had the real power, and he knew he had to prove it, not just with titles, but with victories. In the early years of his reign, he faced a series of revolts from Syria to Babylon. Vassals such as Israel, Hamath, and even the Phoenician city-states banded together to test the new king. But Sargon was unmoved. He responded by deploying the full might that Tiglath-Pileser had left behind: his standing army, his chariots, his logistical network, and personally led the army to quell the rebellion. He captured Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, and undertook one of the largest resettlements in ancient history. Tens of thousands of people were removed from their ancestral lands, and people from elsewhere were brought in to replace them. The population was deliberately disrupted to erase the ethnic identity and replace it with a new identity: citizen of Assyria. With Babylon, he used not the sword, but politics and symbols. He proclaimed himself King of Babylon, performed the most ancient rites of the Southerners, and rebuilt the great abandoned temples. He understood that he could not rule Babylon with iron and steel, but by making them believe that he was the legitimate heir to the god Marduk. But Sargon II was not just a strategist, he was a builder. In his heart, the idea of a new capital was burning, a center not only of politics, but of the idea of absolute power. And so the project of Dur-Sharrukin, which means Sargon's fortress, began. Dur-Sharrukin was not a city that sprang up by chance from the flow of trade or strategic location. It was designed from top to bottom by a dynastic vision. Built near Nineveh, on a flat plain, Sargon laid out the city in a perfect square, with 4 main gates facing the cardinal directions, and a central royal palace surrounded by temples, administrative offices, and housing for the ruling class. The walls were thick and high, decorated with reliefs depicting the king's triumphs, his vassal troops bearing tribute, and mythical creatures, Lamassu, with the body of a lion, the head of a man, and the wings of an eagle, guarding the entrances. All conveyed the message. This was a place where the divine and the powerful lived side by side. To build it, he mobilized tens of thousands of workers, Assyrians, slaves from his campaigns, and craftsmen from all over. Bricks, limestone, cedar, copper, and gold were brought from as far away as Anatolia, the Levant, and Elam. Each material bore the mark of a conquered territory, making the city a microcosm of the entire empire. But Sargon II was not all about brick walls. He organized irrigation systems, built huge granaries, and established a cuneiform writing school where scribes were trained to court standards. Dur-Sharrukin was more than just a symbol. He was the most advanced administrative brain of the time. As Dur-Sharrukin grew, Sargon became more and more confident in his empire. He extended Assyria's borders westward to Cilicia and the Mediterranean coast, eastward to the Zagros, and northward to Lake Van, making Assyria a full-fledged superpower from the borders of modern Iran to Lebanon, from Armenia to the Persian Gulf. But history has never been a smooth road. In 705 BC, while on a military campaign in the northern region of Tabal, Sargon II was killed in battle, and strangely, his body was never found. A powerful, accomplished king ended in mystery, as if fate itself wanted to emphasize that when a man wants to create an empire without borders, death itself cannot be a limit. His son, Sennacherib, succeeded him and abandoned Dur-Sharrukin, moving the capital to Nineveh. The great city that Sargon built lasted only one lifetime. But what he left behind, his urban design, his idea of a unified empire, and the image of the king as the center of the cosmic order, reverberates in every clay tablet, every wall, every line of epic poetry that followed. Sargon II was not a man born to be loved. He was a man born to reshape the empire with his hands, his mind, and his desire beyond the map. And so, in the flat desert, Dur-Sharrukin still stands, not just an ancient city, but a symbol of an Assyria that knows no boundaries, neither geographical nor imaginative. At the heart of the Assyrian Empire, where time seemed to stand still amid the hammering of masonry and the gurgling of canals, a city rose from the dust to become a symbol of power, wealth, and wisdom: Nineveh. It was not just a capital, but a declaration in stone, water, and light of the vision of a king named Sennacherib. Sennacherib succeeded his father, Sargon II, in 705 BC during a period of fraught transition. The court was still reeling from Sargon's mysterious death during the campaign at Tabal, and the city of Dur-Sharrukin he had built had just been completed but still lacked the vitality of a truly living center. While many expected Sennacherib to continue to develop Dur-Sharrukin, he chose otherwise. He returned to Nineveh, an ancient city that had long since been established, but under his rule would become the true heart of the empire. Nineveh, strategically located on the east bank of the Tigris, was once one of the oldest centers of commerce and religion in Assyria. However, under Sennacherib, the city would become a modern metropolis by ancient standards, a true Pearl of the Orient. He began by overhauling the entire irrigation system. Knowing that water was the soul of a city, Sennacherib built a massive system of canals to bring water from the distant mountains to Nineveh. The most famous of these was the Kosser Canal, an engineering feat that carried water through the mountains, complete with aqueducts, dams, and an elaborate flood control system. One of the most notable sections was the Jerwan Aqueduct, built of precisely cut stone and waterproof cement, a technology centuries ahead of its time. When the water poured in, Nineveh was transformed. Large gardens grew within the city, trees were planted along the main roads, and squares became places for meetings, festivals, and honoring the king who had brought life to the desert. The city was planned with 15 gates, each with thick walls, and guarded by giant statues of Lamassu, half lion, half man with wings, symbolizing protection and authority. Not stopping at infrastructure, Sennacherib also carried out a revolution in palace architecture. He built the Southwest Palace, a great complex of hundreds of rooms, long corridors inlaid with reliefs depicting his exploits, victorious armies, and court life. The walls were covered with intricately carved limestone reliefs, not only works of art, but also a visual epic of his reign. His throne room was the center of power. Its ceilings were high, its walls were decorated with cedar beams, and its walls were inlaid with gold and precious stones from all over the empire. Diplomats, merchants, and envoys from Babylon, Elam, and Egypt bowed before the majestic image of a king who ruled not only by sword, but also by wisdom and construction. Under Sennacherib's rule, Nineveh became a center of culture and learning. Scribes were educated at the royal schools, learning to write cuneiform on clay tablets. The archives included royal decrees, tax records, diplomatic letters, and astrological records. Scholars came from all over the empire to study mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, laying the foundations for the next generation, especially his grandson Ashur-banipal, who would go on to build the largest library of antiquity. Although Sennacherib loved to build, he never forgot his role as a warrior. Throughout his reign, he waged a series of military campaigns to maintain and expand his empire. One of the most famous was the siege of Jerusalem in 701 BC, where he confronted the kingdom of Judah. Although the city was not captured, the campaign is recorded in detail in reliefs at his palace, a reminder of Assyria's military might. However, his hard-line personality and far-reaching reforms also earned him many enemies, especially in Babylon. He completely destroyed the holy city in 689 BC, an act that caused great controversy within the court and priesthood. Many saw it as an insult to the southern gods, especially Marduk, Babylon's patron god. Although he later sought to reconcile by rebuilding temples, hostilities continued to simmer. In 681 BC, in an event that has never been fully clarified, Sennacherib was assassinated by his own two sons, Ardamulissu and Nabushar-Usur, who felt betrayed by his designation of his youngest son, Esarhaddon, as his successor. The incident shocked the court, but Esarhaddon quickly put things right and continued his father's legacy. Though his death was tragic, Sennacherib's legacy is undeniable. Nineveh, under his leadership, was not just a city. It was a living symbol of a grand vision, a place where men and gods coexisted, where civilization could flourish in the dust, where power was not only expressed through the sword, but also through the harmony of technology, art, and philosophy of governance. Today, although much of Nineveh is in ruins, when the afternoon sun slants down on the remaining stone walls, one can still feel the breath of a golden age, of a city once called the Pearl of the Orient, and of a king named Sennacherib, who turned dreams into stone, water, and eternity. Not all kings wielded swords. Some wielded pens and left a mark even deeper than the blade. In the history of Assyria, amid the wars of conquest, the fiery dynasties, and the iron rule, a different figure emerged, a king who loved knowledge, honored writing, and preserved human wisdom. That was Ashurbanipal. The son of Esarhaddon, grandson of Sennacherib, he was born into a world of power and chaos, but his heart was more inclined to clay tablets than spears. In the palace of Nineveh, where light shone through the stone doors carved with lamassu, Ashurbanipal learned not only the art of statecraft, but also to read ancient languages, from Sumerian to Akkadian, from Babylonian to Elam. He was the only king in Assyrian history who could read and write cuneiform himself, something previously reserved for the most learned scholars. Unlike his predecessors who relied on scribes to interpret texts, Ashurbanipal pored over thousands of ancient manuscripts himself, from epics like Gilgamesh to medical, astronomical, and religious texts. Knowledge was power to him, no less than any army that had conquered Babylon or Elam. With that realization, he decided to build something no one had ever thought possible: the royal library at Nineveh, a repository of all the ancient wisdom he could gather from all over the empire. Ashurbanipal sent scholars, envoys, and scribes to every corner of the land. The ancient temples of Sippar, the libraries of Babylon, the writing centers of Sumer, the Hittite kingdoms, and even the cities of Elam. From there, they copied every type of text they could find and brought it back to Nineveh as treasures. The tablets record epics, myths, sacrificial rituals, astrological texts, medical texts, laws, prayers, and royal correspondence. Some are as big as the palm of your hand, while others are nearly a meter long, meticulously recording recipes for treating diseases, observing the sky, and predicting the future. Each line of cuneiform writing was hand-copied and placed on stone shelves in cool storage rooms inside the palace. Ashurbanipal organized the texts by subject, and sometimes personally checked the contents to ensure accuracy. Among the more than 30,000 tablets found by modern archaeologists in the ruins of the library is the most complete copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale of death, immortality, and human limitations. There are also Babylonian medical texts describing hepatitis, epilepsy, and herbal remedies. There are records of eclipses, constellations, and their influence on the fortunes of the empire. There are also letters between the king and governors in Egypt or Syria, reflecting the sophisticated network of international relations that Assyria maintained. Despite his love of learning, Ashurbanipal was a warrior. He led great campaigns, most notably the conquest of Elam, where he not only destroyed Susa, but also brought back all the precious texts to his library. He understood that true victory was not just about conquering land, but also about capturing the memory of a civilization. However, the light of knowledge was sometimes obscured by the darkness of ambition. Towards the end of his reign, discontent within the royal family, conflicts between princes, and the rise of the Medes and their Babylonian allies caused the empire to falter. After Ashurbanipal's death around 627 BC, Nineveh gradually lost its central position. In 612 BC, the city was besieged and destroyed. The palaces were burned, the idols were smashed, and the library, the pride of human knowledge, was buried in ashes. Yet it was that layer of ash that protected the clay tablets for millennia. When modern archaeologists excavated the ruins of Nineveh, they found not just a library, but a treasure trove of human wisdom. What Ashurbanipal accumulated has withstood time, destruction, and war, leaving behind a magnificent legacy for posterity. Ashurbanipal is considered the founder of the idea of preserving knowledge for the benefit of the future, overcoming the prejudice of the age of kings who only knew war. His library became a model for Alexandria, Constantinople, and later Western universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. As night falls on the broken walls and the wind blows through the sandy paths of Nineveh, one thing remains indestructible: knowledge. It lives in cuneiform inscriptions, in the stories of the gods, and in the endless whispers of the past. Ashurbanipal was gone, Nineveh had fallen, but the royal library he built, forgotten for 2 millennia, remains one of the most marvelous testaments to the faith in the power of writing. And perhaps, as he closed his eyes in the stone room at the heart of his palace, the king knew it. Knowledge is eternal. When you think of Assyria, you often picture mighty armies, galloping chariots, and bas-reliefs depicting executions of enemies. But that's just the surface. What really made Assyria a massive, enduring empire was not brutality, but organization, a political and administrative system designed with almost mechanical precision. An empire fought not with swords and spears, but with roads, bureaucracies, and the forced movement of hundreds of thousands of people. This is the story of an imperial machine, oiled by fear, powered by surveillance, and sustained by chilling efficiency. Rhodes, the blood veins of Empire Tiglath-Pileser III, a king famous for his military reforms, also laid the foundations for one of the most sophisticated transportation systems in the ancient world. When he came to power, Assyria needed more than just victory. It needed control. And, to control, it needed connection. Paved roads, running through valleys, over mountains, across deserts, connected the capital Nineveh to frontier cities like Carchemish, Ashdod, and even Memphis in Egypt. Roads were designed not just to transport armies, but also for envoys, merchants, and, above all, to deliver royal orders with lightning speed. Along the main routes, royal supply stations were built every 20 to 30 kilometers. Each station had its own horses, guards, and food stores. Thanks to this system, letters from Nineveh could reach Gaza in just a few days, a remarkable speed in an era with no electricity, no motorized vehicles, just horses and wooden wheels. The governor, the hands of the king, no emperor, no matter how great, could rule an empire spanning thousands of miles without authority. And the Assyrians understood that better than anyone. The empire was divided into provinces, each with a governor, Shaknu, appointed directly from the royal family. These were not local nobles or hereditary heirs, but central officials, trained and tightly controlled. The governors were responsible for collecting taxes, recruiting soldiers, maintaining the law, monitoring the population, and sending regular reports back to the palace. They had absolute power locally, but they were also closely monitored. If there was any sign of corruption, treachery, or simply ineffectiveness, they were replaced immediately, or even executed. So the system was both empowering and frightening, and it was a way to keep the wheels of empire turning. Forced migration, the silent weapon. It's not enough to just knock down. The Assyrians understood that if they punished without uprooting the enemy would grow back like weeds after the rains. Their solution? Take away the entire population. When a rebellious land was subdued, the army didn't just plunder or kill, it organized a mass migration. The survivors were forced to leave their homeland, traveling hundreds of miles to foreign lands, where they had no roots, no community, no memories to resist. In return, people from elsewhere were brought in to replace them, diluting and losing the local identity. This was a sophisticated technique of forced socialization. The Assyrians didn't destroy peoples, they made them forget who they were. In the records of the campaigns, the numbers are enormous. 27,000 Arameans were displaced, 13,000 Elamites, 200,000 Israelites. These people were assigned as farmers, craftsmen, mercenaries, or forced laborers. They became part of the empire, but never its center. Logistics. The key to power. All great victories had one thing behind them: food. Assyria organized large-scale grain reserves at strategic points. Carts carrying wheat, dates, salted fish, dried meat were coordinated in cycles, distributed according to plans to each province, each army. Without logistics, there was no war. Without food, there was no dynasty. And Assyria, more than any other empire of its time, understood that. Surveillance, the eye of the empire. No one was allowed to escape the king's eye. The satraps monitored the people, but they were also monitored. A special force called the Eyes and Ears of the King, disguised spies, surprise envoys, cross-checked letters, all formed a surveillance network throughout the empire. No act of rebellion could go unnoticed by Nineveh, and when it did, the response was swift, ruthless, and uncompromising. The price of efficiency. But like any machine, when it worked too well, it became rigid. Assyria gradually became an empire that could not be flexible, could not change. Every supply station, every satrap, every migrant caravan was a burden. And then, as larger waves of resistance, from Babylon, from the Medes, from the Western alliances came up at the same time. The giant machine could not react fast enough. Each stuck cog was a link that collapsed, and the empire stopped. The legacy of a machine. Today, when people think of the Assyrians, they remember their ruthlessness. But few see the other side. They were masters of organization, planning, and administration. The roads they built laid the foundations for the Persian, Greek, and Roman transportation routes. Their administrative systems influenced later dynasties in the Middle East, and their policy of forced migration, though condemned, was copied by later empires, from Babylon to Rome, from China to Spain. The machine stopped working, but its echoes still live on in ancient documents, in the ruins of royal roads, and in lessons about power, control, and the consequences of running an empire too perfectly. No civilization has ever reached supreme power without mastering the art of war. For the Assyrians, war was more than a means. It was the axis of their empire. War was the reason for building roads, collecting taxes, forcing peoples to migrate, building fortifications, creating libraries, and writing. In the eyes of the Assyrians, war was not an anomaly. It was the natural state of the world. They did not fight for honor or for gods. They fought like engineers. Each battle was a construction. Each army was a machine. Each victory was a calculation. And in the coldness of that calculation, their empire grew, in blood, in steel, in fire. Infantry. The foundation of the system. The core of the Assyrian army was the infantry, not as flashy as chariots, not as fast as cavalry, but precise, steadfast, disciplined as stone. Each unit consisted of a few dozen men, divided into squads from archers to spearmen, shieldmen, engineers, and light artillerymen. Their equipment was scale armor, made from small pieces of metal layered like fish scales, worn over leather vests. When the sun shone on them, their armor glowed like a walking metal wall. When they marched, the sound of weapons clashing resounded like a death drum. Their weapons were not only swords and spears, but also battle axes, trident hammers, composite bows, bows made from wood, sinew, and horn, capable of piercing the enemy's bronze armor. Each archer was trained to shoot accurately from a distance of more than 150 meters, while maintaining a tight formation. Cavalry. The army of lightning. Assyria was one of the first empires to turn cavalry into a regular force. Before that, most ancient civilizations used chariots as their means of combat. But chariots were heavy, prone to overturning, and could not be used in rocky or densely forested terrain. The Assyrians trained special war horses, strong, fast, and able to withstand the heat. Each cavalryman carried a long spear or a short bow and wore light armor to move flexibly. In battle, they moved like birds of prey, attacking and retreating, turning around and attacking again, causing the enemy to panic and disintegrate before the infantry arrived. A common tactic was to feign retreat, luring the enemy to pursue, then turning around and counter-attacking from both sides. Assyrian cavalry did not fight alone. They fought as part of a coordinated dance of war, where each horse's step was a beat of death. Engineers. The brain of the battle. When approaching a city, the Assyrians did not wait for the enemy to come out of the gates. They brought in siege engines, the first tanks in human history. These were wheeled siege towers, taller than the walls, covered with thick wooden cladding, shielding archers above and melee soldiers below. They used battering rams, machines with hard wooden heads shaped like goat or bull heads, to smash the gates. Engineers built artificial earthen dikes, raising the road to the level of the top of the walls. They dug tunnels under the walls to bury primitive explosives, a mixture of sulfur and oil, to blow up the foundations. And they used giant turtle-shaped shields, carried by soldiers, to move slowly like crawling boulders to the walls, where they could place ladders, shoot arrows, or dig foundations. Siege warfare was a dark art, where the attacker was part warrior, part architect, part butcher. Psychological warfare, the invisible weapon. One of the Assyrians' most formidable weapons was fear. Before attacking, they sent letters to the kings of the target cities, demanding their surrender. Included in the letters was the skull of the previous king, or a flayed messenger. After taking the city, they made a show of their punishment, impaling opponents at the gates, hanging their bodies, building skull towers. This was not senseless barbarism, it was propaganda. These images were copied in cuneiform and circulated throughout the empire, so that other towns would know what to expect if they opposed Nineveh. Organization, the key to strength. The Assyrian army was not only strong because of its weapons, but because of the way it operated as a system. Each army had a clear hierarchy of command, from general, Turtanu, to provincial commander, Rab Eshirti, to unit captain, Rab Kishir. Before each campaign, they organized logistics, made maps, and set up supply stations. They calculated the weather, routes, and food consumption. They had a strategic archive, where they recorded the battlefield, losses, and effectiveness in order to improve tactics. The art of disappearing. When necessary, the Assyrian army also knew when to retreat. They did not fight to the death. They fought until they achieved their objective. If surrounded, they did not hold out to the end. They retreated in an organized manner, carrying their weapons, wounded, and maps. This is what set them apart from the nomadic tribes. They did not fight for personal honor. They fought for efficiency. In the bottom line, not a killing machine, but a war mind. More than 3,000 years ago, in the red dust of Mesopotamia, the Assyrians did not just conquer, they built. They did not just destroy, they created. They did not just strike, they understood the rules of the game. They were not as crazy as the Huns, nor as sanctified as the Spartans. They simply saw war as a science, where the best survived. When one looks back at their glorious victories, from Elam to Egypt, from Urartu to Babylon, one sees more than blood. One sees logic, technique, psychology, discipline, and organizational thinking. That is what made the Assyrians the first ancient designers of war in human history. In the long history of mankind, few empires have made fear such an official part of state policy as the Assyrians. If the previous chapter was about the machinery of war, this one is about the mindset that ran the empire with calculated ruthlessness. The Assyrians understood one thing: winning in battle is not enough. Winning in the minds, winning in the memories, and winning in the dreams of the enemy, that is true domination. And to do that, they nurtured a monster within their system, a monster called terror. When ruthless is policy. In the ancient stone inscriptions that survived from Nineveh, Kalhu, and Dur Sharukin, we see hundreds of scenes of torture, beheading, flaying, hanging, disembowelment, burning alive, described in such detail that it almost seems boastful. But these were not simply historical paintings. They were warnings, symbols, and propaganda tools. One of the most common rituals was the practice of live impalement. Opponents, from leaders to commoners, were tied to sharp stakes and left to burn, swarm with flies, and suffer until they died. The stakes were erected at the city gates, which people had to pass through every day. The soldiers didn't just kill, they performed death. They built skull towers, carved the names of their victims into stone pillars, and even sent souvenirs to the king, an ear, a hand, or a bloody skull. Why? Because the Assyrians didn't just want to kill their enemies. They wanted to prevent future enemies from forming. They didn't want to retake a city twice. They wanted to take it once, leaving its ghost there forever. The policy was informally called psychologizing submission. After each victory, they did not allow silence. They blew trumpets of victory, spread out their men, and told the story in exaggerated terms, so that all the neighboring lands would learn a lesson. And what was even more terrifying, even peoples who had never fought against Assyria chose to surrender just because they heard the story. Kings, leaders of horror. Sennacherib once ordered the city of Babylon to be razed to the ground. Water from the Euphrates River poured into the temples, covered the foundations with stones, plowed the land, and cursed the land forever. Ashur-Nasirpal II boasted, "I burned 3,000 people alive, cut off their hands and feet, and built a tower of skulls. Those who survived, I took out their eyes. I did this so that Nineveh would be safe." Ashur-Banipal, the scholar king, also had a dark side. Under him, the persecutions of Elam, Arabs, and Egyptians were carried out with the meticulousness of a librarian. Each massacre was recorded in detail, carefully archived, a dossier of evil. Terror was systemic, not partial violence, did not come from a few extremists. It came from the entire structure. Soldiers were encouraged to be brutal. Commanders were rewarded for punishing thoroughly. Even the civil officials, the mere writers, were required to describe the terror in detail, to be sent back to the capital. In such a system, violence became a language learned in childhood, used in politics, passed down through stone statues, spread through legends, carved into cuneiform tablets, and passed down through the generations. Fear is engraved into culture. Cruelty to suppress rebellion. Rebellion to maintain order. Order to maintain empire. Empire to feed the palace. Palace to protect the gods. Gods to legitimize cruelty. A circle of divine violence. Was it just raw violence? No. Assyrian brutality was not madness. It was designed. They did not burn 10,000 people at random. They chose the people, the place, the time to maximize the impact on the social psychology. There were even symbolic brutalities. For example, when a rebellious chief was flayed alive, his skin was taken back and hung in the temple of Ashur, as a reminder, God does not forget. Effectiveness and cost. Undeniably, that policy of violence sustained the empire for more than 300 years. The lands were more afraid than angry. Rebellions were rare because the people no longer dared to hope. But it also cost Assyria its allies, its trade partners, and its true loyalties. It built its empire not on cooperation, but on submission. When the machine began to rust, no one came to their aid. When Nineveh burned, the surrounding city-states did not weep, but rejoiced. The monster feed out of control. The price of nurturing violence is that violence becomes natural. Not only are the enemies afraid, the Assyrians themselves begin to fear their government. Suspicion, surveillance, expropriation, denunciation spread like a slow fire. Finally, when there is no one left to kill, the monster turns its teeth on the very empire that created it. A lesson for humanity. Assyria teaches us, violence can build an empire, but not the hearts of men. You can rule with fear, but not forever. You can build temples with skulls, but you can't pray from a broken soul. And that, the biggest monster, sometimes isn't outside the city gates, but right in the heart of the court. Palaces of stone, Assyrian art and architecture. Imagine a bright morning in ancient Nineveh. The pale light of dawn filters through a thin layer of mist, reflecting softly on the towering walls paved with blue tiles. Giant lamassu, mythical creatures with the head of a man, the body of a lion, and the wings of an eagle, stand silently guard at the main gate. Beneath them, the stone floor is cool, each square tile seemingly drawn from a divine blueprint. This space is not simply the residence of a king, it is a declaration in stone, an affirmation that Assyrian power is eternal. The Assyrians conquered not only with swords and horses, they conquered with images, with symbols, by making anyone who entered the silent halls feel small before the absolute power of the throne. That is why art and architecture in the Assyrian Empire were never just decorative. They were part of a vast political machine, where every relief, every corridor, every column had a purpose: to maintain order, to impress, and to immortalize the kingship. Unlike civilizations that favored religious or agricultural symmetry, Assyria built architecture as a system of tools to serve the policy of social control. Cities like Kalhu, Nimrud, Dur-Sharrukin, and Nineveh were planned according to the center of power model, meaning that all roads, buildings, and squares led to the center of power, the king's palace. But what made these structures legendary were the mythical, historical, and propagandistic artistic details carved into every stone and plastered on every wall. As you pass through the main gate of Sargon II's palace at Dur-Sharrukin, you will encounter a series of lamassu standing guard, each weighing tens of tons, more than 3 meters high, meticulously carved down to every whisker and every line on its wings. The Assyrians believed that lamassu were not only guardians, but also the extended arms of the king. If anyone tried to trespass, the lamassu's eyes would be the eyes of the king, and its claws would be the claws of justice. Behind the lamassu are endless corridors covered with stone reliefs depicting the royal exploits, battles in Urartu, chains of prisoners, lion hunts, all carved in astonishing detail. Among them, the most prominent is the lion hunt of Ashurbanipal. There, the king was no ordinary man. He was the embodiment of the god of war, standing alone in the arena, facing the wild beast that represented chaos. The bloody, painful scene was not avoided, but it was not offensive. On the contrary, it had a ceremonial meaning, as if only that life and death confrontation could establish the survival of the dynasty. The floors in the great halls were paved with baked bricks, arranged in precise geometric patterns, creating a visual effect that made people feel like they were lost in a sacred maze. The ceilings were often covered with precious wood, inlaid with jade or painted, reflecting the light of oil lamps to create shimmering halos like stars at night. The light in the Assyrian palace was never accidental. It was arranged according to the principle of guidance, centripetal, strong light at the entrance, gradually fading as it entered the center, like a ritual that made people feel like they were approaching the sacred area, where there was no longer any mundane. At Nineveh, Sennacherib's palace also featured a system of water channels, stone fountains, and courtyards planted with shade trees, a rarity in the semi-desert. This shows that the Assyrians not only built to impress, but were also practical in terms of climate and living conditions. Many of the stone slabs also bear cuneiform inscriptions detailing the quantities of materials, labor, and construction time, as if the ancient architects were saying, "We don't just dream, we calculate." Color was also an important part. Although most of the sites today are gray stone and dried clay, research shows that the walls, columns, and statues in the palace were once painted in brilliant colors: vermilion, gold, turquoise, and emerald green. When the sunlight shines through, the entire space is like a glowing jade block, making anyone who enters overwhelmed by the surreal beauty, a beauty that is not intended to relax, but to leave a lasting impression, as if to engrave in the viewer's memory. This is the center of the world. In addition to the reliefs and lamassu, Assyrian architecture is also notable for its system of thick, high walls with watchtowers at regular intervals, both for protection and to demonstrate authority. The city gates are often designed to curve, forcing people to go around before entering, a clever way to slow down the enemy's steps and force them to see the entire majesty of the citadel. In the more sacred areas, such as the temples of Ishtar and Nabu, the architecture is scaled back and more discreet. Round stone columns with capitals carved with lotus flowers and eagle wings, representing life and knowledge. The scent of burning resin and sandalwood permeates the space, combined with the dim lighting, to create an atmosphere that is half real and half dreamlike. For the Assyrians, the temple was not just a place of prayer. It was also a space to re-establish the order of the universe, where every detail, whether a vase or a paving stone, played a role in that great ritual. The sophistication of the architectural art did not stop at the interior. The hanging gardens, the courtyards, and especially the hanging corridors, like long balconies overlooking the square, were designed so that the royal family could observe and be observed. Allowing the common people to see the king from a distance was part of the policy, not to be close, but to reinforce the awe-inspiring distance. Every brick, every block of stone, every carving, it is a silent declaration. This is a place of gods, of kings, of history, and you are just a passing visitor. When people leave the halls, they do not take with them objects, they take with them memories. Memories of a place where time does not pass, where stone has a soul, and where beauty is not gentle but fierce. That is the essence of Assyrian art and architecture. Not soft like Greece, not ethereal like Egypt, but majestic, precise, cold, and absolute. A greatness built on calculation, on iron faith, and on the desire to eternalize power with things that cannot burn or rot with time. The roar of lamassu, myth, protection, and identity. long before the first words were engraved on clay tablets, before the first kings of Assyria erected the first fortifications on the banks of the Tigris, stories existed. Stories that did not need paper or ink. They lived in mothers' lullabies, in short stories whispered around campfires, in ancient rituals when the sun rose and darkness had not yet retreated from the desert. One of those stories, more powerful than any spear, more profound than any chronicle, is the legend of Lamassu. Lamassu is not just a statue, not just a palace decoration. Lamassu is a symbol, a declaration, a warning. The Lamassu image combines the most powerful elements in nature: the head of a human, a symbol of wisdom; the body of a lion or bull, a symbol of unconquerable strength; eagle wings, for protection from above, from the divine realm. But hidden deep within that structure, the Lamassu also carried a sacred mission: to protect order, to ward off chaos, and to maintain the spiritual identity of the kingdom. When standing before a city gate or a palace hall, the Assyrians knew they were not just entering a physical space. They were entering a boundary, the boundary between the profane world and the sacred realm, the boundary between the chaos outside and the order within. And it was at that threshold that the Lamassu was present, as a gatekeeper to the sacred world. In Nineveh, in Dur-Sharrukin, in Kalhu, throughout the centers of Assyria's power, the Lamassu was placed with great honor at the intersections, where people moved from being ordinary people to being subjects. When a delegation from a distant land came to see the king, their first step was to pass between two Lamassu, as if between two gods examining the heart. What is special is that Lamassu usually have 5 legs, a strange but well-calculated detail. From the front, you see a majestic figure standing upright, but when you move to the side, you see it walking, not static, not completely dynamic. It is alive, always there, ready to intervene when order is threatened. The Assyrians never carved Lamassu with a fierce face. On the contrary, the Lamassu's expression is always calm. The eyes are large and deep, the lips are slightly closed, as if it knows everything but does not need to speak. It does not scream. It roars silently. It roars not with sound, but with presence. In the Assyrian mind, Lamassu does not just live in stone, it lives in spirit. Many clay tablets record the prayers of families to the Lamassu guardian deities, asking for protection from evil spirits, disease, and war. They believed that if a Lamassu was erected in the right place, with the right ritual, even lost souls would not dare to approach. The Lamassu was also a symbol of national identity. While neighboring civilizations worshipped many gods whose forms changed over time, the Lamassu remained virtually unchanged over the centuries. It was a red thread that ran through Assyrian history, an image closely linked to the idea, who we are and what we protect. Not only in the palace, Lamassu also appeared on seals, coats of arms, and even on the walls of houses. People made terracotta Lamassu to hang on the door, as a house god for the mortal world. In funeral rites, the Lamassu's name is often mentioned as a guide, helping the soul not to stray between the heavens and the underworld. There are also folk legends that, on the night of the blood moon, if a king commits a serious mistake, the Lamassu at the palace gate will shed tears of stone, as a sign that order has been broken and the gods no longer protect. No one has ever witnessed such a scene, but as long as the story exists, it is enough to keep the law from being overstepped. Over time, new civilizations arose. Kings and kings took turns. City gates crumbled. Walls were buried under dust. But the Lamassu statues remained, steadfast, immovable, and immortal. When Western archaeologists first excavated the palaces of Khorsabad or Nimrud in the 19th century, they could not believe their eyes when they saw the giant blocks of stone with human faces, divine wings, and lion bodies. Even when brought to the British Museum, the Louvre, or Baghdad, the Lamassu remained in the same pose, head held high, eyes fixed on an invisible point beyond physical space. It belonged to no place, nor was it bound by time. The Lamassu was a living memory of a once dominant civilization, a symbol that could not be extinguished by fire or war. Today, in museums, people often see Lamassu as an ancient work of art. But for those who have walked the silent nights of Nineveh, who have passed between the two Lamassu, who have heard the stories of them from their fathers, they know these are not just stones, these are spirits. A spirit that does not speak. It only roars in silence. The final storm, revolt, invasion, and the fall of Nineveh. As the last sun set over the towering walls of Nineveh, the last glimmer of an empire that had dominated the Near East began to fade. Beneath the blood-red sunset, the golden domes, the marble palaces, and the Lamassus guarding the gates all still stood, defiant, defying fate. But it was then that Assyria began to die. The story of Nineveh's fall did not begin with the sound of drums or spears. It began with long weariness, pride, and small cracks in the empire's heart. Cracks that no one cared to notice, until they became abysses. Over the centuries, the Assyrian Empire had not only built a superior war machine, but also a network of control based on fear. Each conquered land was a chain that tightened around the throne of Nineveh. But then, those chains began to break, link by link. In the south, Babylon rose. The new king, Nabopolassar, no longer wanted to be a Syrian puppet. He quietly rallied his people, re-establishing their loyalty and dreaming of restoring the glory of ancient Babylon. In the east, the Medes, their sworn enemies, defeated by Assyria for centuries, began to rally under the banner of King Cyaxares, a leader who was both brave and wise. In 614 BC, the Medes attacked Ashur, the sacred city and former capital of Assyria. They destroyed temples, slaughtered civilians, and spread terror. Soon, the Medes' Babylonian alliance was formed, and their next target was clear: Nineveh. The city was not only the political heart of the empire, it was also its symbolic heart. The fall of Nineveh meant cutting off the head of the serpent, ending the myth of Assyrian invincibility. In the summer of 612 BC, as the winds from the Zagros began to blow across the northern plains of Mesopotamia, the combined forces of the Medes and Babylonians, along with some Scythians and Cimmerians, marched on Nineveh. Modern scholars estimate that it was probably one of the largest sieges in the ancient world. Nineveh was surrounded by walls 30 meters thick and more than 20 meters high, with 15 large gates, thousands of soldiers, and carefully stored food stores. The city had a sophisticated irrigation system, supplied by a canal from the Khosr River, and was protected by walls upon walls, watchtowers, and long-range bows. But inside, The mood was no longer one of glory, one of anxiety, one of collapse. King Sinshar-Ishkun, a descendant of the great Ashurbanipal, no longer had prestige, power, or allies. The Assyrian army, exhausted by decades of war, was now facing a coalition of enemies. The siege began with trumpets and drums. The Medes built siege mounds. The Babylonians used chariots to batter the city. The attacks were relentless day and night. And then, according to the historian Berossus, an event occurred that would fork in the history books: a flood. A heavy rain that lasted for days caused the Tigris River to swell, breaching a section of Nineveh's southwestern wall. It was the first breach and the last. The Allied forces stormed in, fires burned throughout the palace, temples collapsed, people fled. The Epic of Gilgamesh, once handwritten in the library of Ashurbanipal, was burned. Statues of gods were smashed. Reliefs celebrating the victories of Sargon and Sennacherib burned, shattered. The empire that once made the world tremble knelt in flames. Within the shattered walls of Nineveh, once the seat of Assyrian power, the royal palace had become a fortress of despair. The vast chambers, decorated with gold tapestries and battle sculptures, now echoed only with the clash of weapons, the sound of fallen men, and the wordless wails of the burning past. King Sinshar-Ishkun, the last king to reign from the throne of Nineveh, was never remembered as a weakling. He did not flee. He did not surrender. As the flames raged through the corridors, he and his courtiers barricaded themselves in the inner palace, fighting to the last. And then, as an ancient ritual, he burned himself in the temple, taking with him the last of Assyrian pride. Not a single member of the royal bloodline remained to rule. When the palace gates collapsed, the Allied forces stormed in and found no throne, only ashes. The gods were carved from limestone. The bronze gates were glowing. All were looted or melted down. The Babylonians and Medes came not to conquer, but to punish. The brutality that Assyria had unleashed now returned like a storm of revenge. Many records record that the entire royal library, containing thousands of cuneiform clay tablets, was burned or buried. But strangely, that was precisely what preserved many of the inscriptions under the hot ash, and thousands of years later they were excavated. Echoes of a civilization buried alive. After days of looting and destruction, Nineveh was no longer Nineveh. The city was erased from ancient maps. Many Greek documents no longer even mentioned it, as if it had never existed. An empire, great, powerful, brutal, disappeared in a matter of weeks. And then, silence. No more Assyrian cavalry in the desert. No more messengers carrying the king's orders across Asia. No more ironclad war chariots. All, like an ancient dream, faded into the sands of time. However, the fall of Nineveh was not the immediate end of the entire Assyrian Empire. Some of the remnants of the army and nobles fled west, regrouping in the city of Haran, where they established a new government and attempted to restore the empire under the name of Ashur-uballit Tsend, the last known king in the Assyrian king list. Haran became an Assyrian refuge, a place where a small glimmer of hope arose that the empire might be revived. But all was illusory. The Medes-Babylonians pursued again. In 609 BC, Haran was attacked and fell. Ashur-uballit II disappeared without a trace. From then on, Assyria ceased to exist as an independent political entity. After the dust settled and the last flames of Nineveh died, a strange thing happened. The world became strangely quiet. There were no triumphal celebrations, no heroic songs, no monuments. The city-states that had been oppressed by Assyria did not erect monuments. No one praised the death of Nineveh. It was an unusual silence, almost awe, or perhaps a guilt that history does not know how to name. The truth is, everyone had trembled under the iron hooves of Assyria, but at the same time, everyone acknowledged that it was Assyria that kept the ancient world in order, however ruthlessly. When the empire collapsed, the power vacuum left behind was not completely filled. New powers, Babylonians, Medes, Egyptians, vied for the remnants of Assyria, but none could recreate the sophisticated machinery of governance. Many of the once vassal cities fell into chaos. Trade was disrupted. The overland routes from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, once protected by the Assyrian army, became dangerous. As far away as Urartu, Cilicia, even Israel were shaken by the rise of independent bands and states. More than one scholar later called the post-Assyrian period the time of the lost rhythm, a period when the whole region fell into a state of semi-anarchy that lasted nearly a century. In Nineveh itself, survivors, if any, wandered among the ashes, digging for burnt breadcrumbs, picking up unburned logs. There were no guards, no markets, no sacrificial bells. Everything became quietly eerie, as if the whole place was trying to forget that this was once the capital of a great civilization. The Babylonians quickly took over southern Mesopotamia. The Medes held the Iranian plateau. As for Assyria, that name gradually disappeared from all political conversation. No one called themselves Assyrian anymore. The remaining townspeople also changed their language, their beliefs. They turned to the gods of the victors as a way to survive. Assyria collapsed not only in political reality, but also in the minds of people. Unlike Egypt, where the sharp pyramids still rise from the desert to remind them of a glorious past, or Babylon, where the legends of the Tower of Babel and the Hanging Gardens still echo through the biblical texts, Assyria disappeared. No one sang of Assyria. No one wrote of Assyrian victories with admiration. No epics praised the bravery of the Assyrian soldier. And strangely, no one, not even the Greek scholars, mentioned Nineveh as a great symbol. The city was buried, literally and figuratively, in deliberate oblivion. The Greeks later spoke of Babylon, of Egypt, even of the Medes, but rarely described Assyria in detail. They called the lands to the east a wilderness of barbarian tribes. They did not know, or did not want to know, that there had once existed an empire that had made the world shudder. The reason for this oblivion probably lies in the very character of the empire. Assyria ruled by fear, not by legend. There were no prominent philosophers or poets. There was no great and lasting religious foundation. There was no sweet memory for posterity to cling to. The world forgot Assyria, and Assyria silently accepted. It took nearly 2,500 years for the desert winds to begin to reveal the buried secret. In the 19th century, European archaeologists, armed with picks and shovels and dreams of discovery, began excavating the land near the Tigris River, now just a barren wasteland. As they dug into the ancient soil at Kuyunjik and Nimrud, they found strangely carved stone walls, lion-headed gods, and thousands of clay tablets, which no one could read. Soon they realized this was Nineveh, and the tablets were part of the royal library of Ashurbanipal, preserved by being burned and buried. The world was astounded. An empire that once ruled the largest area of Asia, from the Zagros Mountains to the Mediterranean coast, from Anatolia to Egypt, had existed, been forgotten, and now rising from the dust like an echo of the past. As British and French archaeologists stood amid the ruins of Sennacherib's palace, quietly wiping away the dust from the cuneiform inscriptions that had lain dormant for millennia, they might have unearthed not just a city, but a dream of a lost empire. They saw corridors where the king's commands had once rung, halls where envoys from around the world had been received, walls carved with scenes of execution and pillage where Assyria had recorded not triumphant victories, but domination through fear. And then it occurred to them, those very carvings, so bloody, so painful, might be part of the reason the world wanted to forget them. Assyria built an empire with steel and whips, but lacked a dream for the world to remember. They were too pragmatic, too ruthless, and too arrogant to understand that power could not last if it was based on force alone. When modern scholars study the history of Assyria, they cannot help but shudder at the sophistication and efficiency of the empire's administrative, construction, military, and logistical systems. But no one can deny that it was their rigidity, their despotism, and their extreme pride that led to their demise. Today, standing in front of the ruined city gates of Nineveh, one can no longer see war chariots or guards with spears. Only the Mesopotamian wind blows through the ancient stones, like a whisper of the past, soft, long, enough to make one shiver in the scorching sun. And we suddenly understand, what was once the greatest in the world will also turn to dust. Assyria is no more. But their echoes, through bricks, through writings, through history lessons, still resound silently, endlessly. No one remembers the names of those who tore down the walls of Nineveh. But the names of the Assyrian kings are still remembered. Those who built Nineveh from the ashes, who turned a tribe on the Tigris into the masters of the world. The cruelty can be condemned, but the greatness cannot be denied. 609 BCE, the end of an empire. When the first rays of sunlight shone on the Mesopotamian plains in 609 BCE, no one knew that it would be the last year that the Assyrians would be remembered as a political power. They had once reigned at the height of power, with the most powerful army, the most magnificent architecture, and the most complex system of governance in the ancient world. But as the dawn broke over the remaining walls of Haran, there was only a weary sigh of a fading dream. After the fall of Nineveh in 612 BCE, the Assyrian remnants did not disappear immediately. They retreated westward to the land of Haran, an ancient fortress near the border between Mesopotamia and Syria. There, they set up a provisional government and declared that there was still a legitimate king, Ashur-uballit II, the last keeper of the fire of the Assyrian dynasty. But what they had in their hands were remnants, a broken army, ruined cities, and a world that had turned its back on them. No empire, no loyalty, only survivors clinging to the past. Ashur-uballit II, with only a few thousand men and a small territory around Haran, declared himself king and allied with Egypt to try to regain power. Pharaoh Necho II, with dreams of re-establishing Egyptian influence in the Near East, agreed to help, hoping that a weak Assyrian existence was better than letting the land fall to the Babylonians and Medes. And so the final battle began. While Necho Set moved north from the Nile Valley, the Egyptian army moved through Canaan and neared the Euphrates, where Haran, the last stronghold of the Assyrian Empire, stood on the brink. They encountered little resistance along the way, as most of the smaller kingdoms had lost faith in either side, or were simply tired of constant warfare. On the other side, Babylon, under the command of Nabopolassar, and later his son Nebuchadnezzar II, knew that this was its last chance to wipe out Assyria once and for all. An empire cannot be reborn without a capital, without an army, and most importantly, without a collective memory to back it up. The Battle of Haran was unlike any major battle in Assyrian history before it. There were no majestic chariots, no banners flying, no pre-battle rituals honoring the god Ashur, just cracked ancient walls, exhausted warriors, and a barren land stained with the blood of generations past. The combined Egyptian-Assyrian forces initially retook Haran, but could not hold it for long. When the Babylonians counterattacked with a larger force, Haran could not hold out. The Assyrians were defeated once again. No one knows for sure how Ashur-uballit II died. There are no official records, no tomb, no farewell song. Some theories suggest that he escaped to Egypt. Others believe that he died in battle and was buried in a pile of nameless corpses, along with the empire he represented. Either way, he was the last king to bear the name of Assyria. After that date, 609 BC is marked as the definitive end of the Assyrian Empire. No more cavalry charging through the desert. No more written records from Nineveh to Anatolia. No more dreams of expansion. Only the wind and the vague stories that remain in the memories of the peoples who once feared them. When Haran fell to Babylon, and Ashur-uballit II disappeared from history as if he had never existed, there was no celebration. No trumpets were blown. No wine was drunk. Even Assyria's enemies, the Babylonians and the Medes, did not celebrate for long. They knew that the time of chaos had only just begun. An empire falls, leaving a huge power vacuum. And as nature would have it, that vacuum will be filled with blood and struggle. In the immediate aftermath of Assyria's fall, Egypt quickly sought to reassert its influence in the Near East. It clashed with Babylon in a series of short but fierce wars. One of the most famous was the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, where Nebuchadnezzar II defeated the combined forces of Egypt and the remnants of the Assyrians for the last time, ending any hope of a revival. During this time, the peoples who had been oppressed by Assyria, such as the Elamites, Urartians, and Aramaean tribes, finally emerged from the shadow of the empire, if only for a short time before new empires arose. But perhaps the most profound consequences were not the war, but the memory. Assyria, so brutal, did not mourn them. No one wrote poems about them. No one wept for them. No one erected memorials. On the contrary, many cities deliberately erased their memory, destroying monuments, scraping off inscriptions, and even smashing the images of Assyrian kings on stone reliefs. The empire that had ruled Mesopotamia for more than 600 years with its sophisticated administration, pioneering warfare techniques, and great store of knowledge, was deliberately forgotten by the world. This oblivion lasted for nearly 2,500 years. From above, if an ancient soul could have observed the world after the fall of Assyria, it would have noticed something strange. Assyria disappeared without a trace, leaving only a void. No other empire that existed with such a terrifying physical presence, with Lamassu sphinxes guarding its palaces, bas-reliefs depicting beheadings and floggings of its enemies, and a meticulous system of recording every detail of its exploits, could have been forgotten for so long. That was not because they were insignificant. On the contrary, they were too great, but also too terrifying. In the collective subconscious of the ancient peoples, Assyria was a darkness that no one wanted to name. And so, when the opportunity arose, they were not only erased militarily, but also erased from the mind. No more legends, no more moral lessons, no more sacred symbols. Assyria was not mythologized like Egypt, not idealized like Greece, not divinized like Rome. They were simply erased. Until one day, nearly 2,500 years later, British archaeologists began excavating near modern Mosul and accidentally reopened the buried gate. They discovered Nineveh. They found the library of Ashur, with thousands of clay tablets recording the erased civilization. They saw Lamassu again. They touched the carvings in stone, and they suddenly understood: an empire can be forgotten, but never completely gone. The larger question began to resonate among historians. How could an empire that was a pioneer in organization and military power be so forgotten by the world? Is absolute power, without compassion and human vision, worth anything? Was the death of Assyria not a disaster, but a lesson for all empires to come? Time is the greatest eraser of history. But sometimes it does not erase completely. It just covers it, waiting for a moment for the memory to revive. When the tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal were read by 19th century eyes, the world was astonished. In those dry, cuneiform lines, there were not only battles and power, but also poetry, mythology, medicine, astronomy, the first works of knowledge of mankind. What Assyria left behind, though not preserved by love, survived thanks to cold recording. And then, people began to understand. Assyria was not just a war machine. It was also the cradle of administration, technology, law, and the art of engraving. They built a huge transportation network. They invented colonial management. They organized their records with an archival system, a rarity in antiquity. But they failed in one thing: to give humanity back to power. The brutality, fear, and desire for immortality of the Assyrian kings made them remembered not as builders, but as spreaders of darkness. And so, when they fell, no one held them in prayer. No one dreamed of the return of Assyria. No one spoke of the name Ashur anymore. Nineveh was forgotten. Ashurbanipal too had no tomb. Haran had no name. Yet, on a quiet night, as you walk through the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where the wind blows over the dunes that were once stained with blood, you may hear, not the sound of swords, not the battle cry, but a whisper as light as dust, like the echo of history. Do not rule by fear if you want to be remembered by love. Do not build an empire with daggers if you do not want to shatter it with your own sword. Because All empires will eventually fall, but only empires that know how to love will live forever in the memory of humanity. Ashes and echoes, what remained after the fall. When the last bricks of Nineveh fell, when the chariots of Babylon crushed the gates of Haran, and when the name Assyria fell silent for more than 2 millennia, people thought the story was over. But in fact, the empire never really disappeared. It simply crumbled into dust, and lives on in echoes that men did not realize they were still listening to. No banner still flies bearing the symbol of Ashur. No king sits on the black basalt throne of Dur-Sharrukin. No inscriptions continue to record the names of great campaigns. And yet, if you have ever studied public administration, heard the concept of provinces, districts, ministries, seen laws written and archived, then you are living in the legacy of the very people that history has willfully forgotten. The fire of organization. Assyria was a warring empire. No one denies that. But what kept it going for more than 6 centuries was not the sword. It was the way it organized power. They didn't just invade, they governed. They didn't just conquer, they took over and transformed. The conquered lands were divided into administrative units, each under loyal governors. Each governor was not just a military lieutenant, but also responsible for collecting taxes, managing agriculture, controlling populations, and even organizing local religions so that they would not conflict with the central government. This sounds simple, to this day. But in the 9th century BC, when most other civilizations were still struggling with clans and tribes, Assyria had built a structure of power that could last for generations. They left a model, and though Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome may have hated them, everyone followed suit. Memories on clay. The royal library of Ashurbanipal, with its thousands of cuneiform tablets, was the first collective mind ever created by man. In a world without paper, without the internet, without the printing press, recording medicine, astronomy, philosophy, legend, ritual, law, and even literature, and storing it systematically, was an act that was almost millennia ahead of its time. After the empire collapsed, the tablets were buried underground, but they did not rot. The clay, burned in the fires of destruction, became eternal. And then, more than 2,000 years later, archaeologists found them again, one by one, read each line. Among them is the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature in the world. There are records of eclipses, of comets, of weather calendars for growing crops. There are also prayers, medical instructions, and curses in ancient languages. Assyria did not leave behind magnificent temples like Egypt, no philosophy like Greece, no lasting empire like Rome, but it did leave behind the memory of a civilization. After the fall of the empire, what remained were not the magnificent monuments or the immortal structures that reached to the sky, like those of the Egyptians. Instead, the legacy of Assyria lies hidden in the smallest details of the modern world. Things we would never know had their origins in a civilization that had been buried under the ashes of history. For example, the work schedule. Sounds strange? But it was the Assyrians who divided up the workday into 7-day rhythms, which later became the week that was popular around the world. Or the system of measuring and recording populations, organizing irrigation canals and traffic by controlled roads, all of which were the seeds of modern administrative systems. Centuries after their disappearance, the Persians learned to organize their empire by dividing it into provinces and appointing satraps, exactly like the Assyrian model. The Greeks, though they considered Assyria barbarians, still admired its ability to control territory and mobilize resources. And the pinnacle was Rome, with all its vast state apparatus, still vaguely reminiscent of the sons of Ashur. Civilization does not need to be loved, but remembered. The most painful thing for Assyria was not defeat, but forgetting. When the Medes and Babylonians razed Nineveh, they did not simply destroy the empire, they deliberately erased all memory. They did what few victors have ever done. They did not bother to rewrite the history of their enemies. No poetry, no myths, no moral lessons, just silence. And so, Assyria, an empire that once stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to Persia, suddenly became a ghost in human memory. But ironically, the very people who wanted to erase them from history were the ones who unwittingly copied them the most. Because you can smash stone statues, you can burn down palaces, you can kill entire royal families, but you cannot kill the structure of thought. When you learn to govern an empire by correspondence, when you organize the storage of knowledge, when you enact laws in writing instead of orally, when you collect taxes periodically, when you record invasions in charts, you are hearing an echo of Assyria without realizing it. Echoes from the ashes, the Lamassu statues, creatures with the bodies of lions, the wings of eagles, and the heads of men, once guarded the gates of the city, silently declaring, "Here is where power resides." Today, they lie scattered in European museums, no longer proud, no longer sacred. They are artifacts, relics, symbols of a power turned to stone. But they are also silent storytellers. They tell us, "I was present. I was everything you are now learning to build." In the dark corners of religious history, Assyria did not disappear. It was absorbed into new beliefs. The god Ashur, the supreme deity of the empire, was no longer worshipped, but his image, his power, his wings, his solar symbolism was reproduced in many later Eastern and Western religious symbols. You can see the shadow of Ashur in the winged angels of Judaism, in the fiery sun motifs of Persian Zoroastrian ritual, and even in some early versions of Christian symbols that were enculturated in the Middle East. It was not a copy, it was an invisible osmosis. As was Gilgamesh's sad poem about loss and death, it spread to other ancient literatures. Passages like, "When I die, who will remember my name? Who will keep alive the dream I saw?" Not just a question for Gilgamesh, but a prophecy for Assyria itself. Assyrian shadows in architecture and symbols of power. Although Assyrian palaces fell, their art forms, narrative reliefs, solid blocks, statues guarding entrances, became a kind of symbolic language that was copied in later imperial buildings. From ancient Persia's Persepolis to Roman temples, even to modern Western government buildings, columns, shafts, ceremonial staircases, all are more or less inspired by the Assyrian model. It proves, when you carve your story in stone, you are sending a letter to the future. Assyria, in the modern human mind. It is interesting that, although Assyria is no longer present in school textbooks like Egypt or Rome, its traces are still very clear in works of fiction, especially fantasy. Civilizations with stone architecture, lion-headed gods, Forbidden libraries, brutal punishments, giant siege weapons, the arrogance of kings, all have the spirit of Assyria. In the world of Tolkien, of George R.R. Martin, of role-playing games, you will encounter kingdoms with a clear Assyrian style. Cold, discipline, immense in scale, and a constant sense of impending collapse. Assyria does not live only in museums. It hides in the human mind, in the obsession with absolute power, and the price to pay for it. The final crack and the lasting lesson. Perhaps the most profound thing that Assyria left behind, not in reliefs or clay tablets, but in an unspoken philosophical question. If an empire can control almost the entire known world and still fall, what empire is truly immortal? That is what every subsequent civilization ponders. That is why, when one studies Assyria, one is not just studying the past, but looking at oneself in the mirror. There is one thing that the ancient Assyrian storytellers understood well, and today we seem to be learning again, that power lies not in weapons, but in memories. When the last warriors of Assyria fall before the Medes, when the royal library burns to ashes, and when children are born and no longer hear the name Ashur mentioned, that is not the end. It was the moment when memory began to take shape. For more than 2,000 years, the world had gone on without knowing that it had walked on the foundations of a silent empire. People had founded nations, rewritten laws, created art, built libraries, without knowing that the first fragments of that wisdom had been in the hands of the Assyrians. No need for temples to stand. No need for names to be recorded. As long as a story continued to be told, a memory still echoed, a person, even just one, remembered. Assyria never disappeared. And so tonight, as you close your eyes, lie still under the warm covers and let your mind travel through time. Imagine yourself walking along an ancient stone road. The sky above you is a purple-red Mesopotamian sunset. In the distance is the silhouette of a lamassu, standing still, stone eyes gazing at the horizon. You hear a whisper, not of gods, not of kings, but of history, of memory, of a civilization that has weathered the storm and left behind an echo, a legacy of stone and clay, what Assyria left to the world. Not all great things exist in the light. There are civilizations that are no longer mentioned often, not engraved in modern textbooks, not majestic monuments in the capitals of countries. And yet, somehow, they still live on, not as dynasties, but as a silent flow in the veins of humanity. Assyria is one of them. If you are listening to this story, imagine yourself entering a dark stone room where the flickering light of ancient torches still imprints on the walls. In that room, there are reliefs carved deep into the stone, recounting the battles, the rituals, and even the daily stories of the Assyrians. It is no coincidence that they chose stone and clay as the place to store their memories, for they knew everything else decays, but clay turns to stone, and stone does not forget. When we talk about the legacy of a civilization, we usually think of the tangible, buildings, monuments, temples, military strategies. But the real legacy of Assyria lies in its inscriptions, in its organization of thought, and in its system of operating the world. It was not a civilization to be admired. It was a civilization to be learned from, and to be quietly reborn through the ages. Among the forgotten stone walls of the royal library of Nineveh, The Assyrians left behind something that perhaps they themselves did not expect would transcend all dynasties: the idea of a systematic library of knowledge. More than just a place to store books, Ashurbanipal's library was a mind made of clay. More than 30,000 hand-carved clay tablets, arranged by subject, medicine, astronomy, literature, magic, geography, diplomacy, military strategy. They didn't just read, they classified. They didn't just take notes, they edited, annotated, and preserved. If Alexandria was the symbol of Western learning, Nineveh was the Alexandria of the East, hundreds of years before. We can imagine the Assyrians understanding that weapons may rule the world for a generation, but knowledge is what lasts forever. From that library, Babylonian, then Persian, then Greek scholars inherited an organized approach to knowledge. And over the centuries, it gave rise to the idea of academic systems, which we see today in every university, research institute, and even in Wikipedia's catalog. In a world where wars were carved into walls and wisdom was stamped into clay, Assyria understood that being in human memory was more important than being on maps. Not only were the Assyrians good at war or storing knowledge, they were also great organizers. While most other civilizations operated on tribal models, temporary alliances, or blood-based power, the Assyrians soon created a structured, specialized, efficient state model. They had administrative provinces, each with a governor, responsible for collecting taxes, managing the population, and periodically reporting to the central government. Above them was the Turtanu, the king's most powerful assistant, running the country during the king's absence or campaign. It was a decentralized but centralized system, operating through reporting, inspection, and punishment for non-compliance. One of the most profound legacies that Assyria left behind was the combination of the rule of law and administrative control. Each tax document was engraved in clay. Each shipment of grain had a receipt. Every military campaign had its own logistical report. It is no coincidence that the Greeks, after conquering the East, were amazed at the capacity for recording, control, and planning they found in the ruins of Assyria. Under the Assyrians' strict hand, the empire was not just a frontier, it was a machine. The machine was lubricated by fear, operated by law, and driven by the belief that the universe was orderly, and so must man. Here is an interesting fact. Assyria was an empire of steel, but it still believed in the power of narrative. This is not obvious. Most military empires, when they reached their peak, ignored poetry and art, or considered them secondary. But Assyria, in the quiet nights after a campaign, its engravers diligently recorded not only the number of war elephants or the booty, but also their dreams, fears, and legends. We find in the Nineveh library the earliest copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the greatest epic of Mesopotamia. The Assyrians did not rewrite it in new writing. They copied, annotated, and preserved the ancient Akkadian and Sumerian texts. This shows that they saw themselves as inheritors of civilization, not just replacements. In terms of symbolism, there is an image that the whole world has seen today: the Lamassu, a creature with the head of a bull, the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the face of a human. It is a symbol of protection of the palace, the city, the soul, and also the balance between power, wisdom, courage, freedom. The Lamassu is not just a statue, it is philosophy incarnated. The Assyrians taught us that if power is to last, it must remind itself of responsibility. Their language, Akkadian, the Assyrian dialect, was standardized for inscriptions, diplomatic and legal documents, and even poetry. And when the Medes ended Assyria's reign, the language survived for centuries in Persian writing. So when we look at cuneiform tablets, we are not just looking at writing. We are reading an ancient dream, preserved by the rough but responsible hands of a civilization once considered brutal. Entering the palace of the Assyrian kings is unlike entering any other place in the ancient world. In Egypt, you see flat, ritualized paintings. In Greece, you see a celebration of the human form. But in Assyria, you are walking among living walls where each block of stone tells a story. Assyrian reliefs are not just works of art, they are visual scripts. Each wall is a chapter. Each frame is a scene. Each character, from kings to warriors to gods, has its own place, expression, and meaning. The lion hunts, the most famous, were not mere displays of strength. They represented the balance between order and chaos, between the king who represented the gods and the wild world that had to be tamed. The Assyrians were one of the first civilizations to use art as a psychological tool. They did not paint for beauty. They carved to make a permanent mark, so that whoever saw it would understand the message of power, faith, and fear. From the way they depicted marching armies, executed enemies, to the winged angels that overshadowed the king, every detail was calculated to convey an unmistakable emotion. It was from this style that later civilizations, such as Achaemenid Persia, drew inspiration, creating Persepolis with its Assyrian-inspired but scaled-up sculpted walls. Then came Rome, with its triumphal motifs, its triumphal arches, its historical sculptures in successive images on its walls and columns, all bearing the traces of Assyrian visual political art. Assyrian art never dies. It transforms. When Nineveh fell in 612 BC, it was believed that an entire civilization had been wiped out. But the truth is, Assyria did not die. It spread. From the ashes of Nineveh, fleeing merchants, scholars, and former officials carried with them the writing, the management system, the organizational mindset, and the harsh discipline that had been cultivated over generations. They carried it to Babylon, then to Persepolis, then to Asia Minor, and finally into the veins of the Greco-Roman world. No one remembers the Assyrians by name, but what they did is still present. Every time you open a digital library, you are living Ashurbanipal's dream. Every country with its provinces, governors, reports, you are seeing the Assyrian model. Every symbol of authority carved into stone, from the Roman Arc de Triomphe to the modern monument, you are seeing the Assyrian style. And every time you tell a story, every time you believe in preserving memory, you are continuing the tradition of those who carved epics in clay. The Assyrians did not leave behind eternal cities, but they left behind something more enduring: principles. The principles that power needs order, wisdom needs storage, civilization needs storytelling, and man, if he is to transcend time, cannot just live. He must carve his name into meaning. Today, when archaeologists bend over the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, they are not just looking for artifacts. They are listening, a voice in clay, The voice whispers, "We were once. We organized, fought, learned, loved, angered, and dreamed. We are no more, but everything you have was once ours." And so, in the modern world, Assyria lives on, not in flags, not in governments, but in systems, memories, and the desire to organize the world with reason. Together we have walked through stone and dust, war and peace, from Ashur to Nineveh, from great dreams to tragic collapses. But all this is not an end, but a beginning of a new vision, that what was lost is actually quietly living within us. If you are still listening, remember, the Assyrian walls are never silent. They are only whispering in the wind. When the last sun set over the charred walls of Nineveh, many thought the story of Assyria was over. The city had fallen, the palace had been plundered, the library had been burned, and the voices that had once echoed across Mesopotamia had fallen silent. But history does not operate like an extinguished fire. It operates like ashes that lie dormant in the earth, waiting for a new wind to blow them away and bring them back to life in a different way. Assyria, for all its ferocity, organization, and spirit, did not die in the darkness of 612 BC. It was fused into the blood of its successor civilizations, especially Persia, and later Rome. What had once defined an unyielding empire did not disappear. It changed its clothes, its language, but its spirit remained. Let us begin with Persia, the Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus the Great. When the Persians rose up and unified much of the Middle East, they did not start from scratch. They came to the ruins of Assyria, not to destroy more, but to learn. The administrative provinces of the Achaemenids were structured similarly to the Assyrian model. Each satrapy, or large province, had a satrap, governor, who was responsible for tax collection, military and civil affairs, just as Assyrian governors had administered their territory. Moreover, the road system that Assyria had pioneered, the bloodlines of the empire, was extended by the Persians into the Royal Road, the famous road from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa in Persia. Along these routes, the idea of administrative control, strict surveillance, and the propagation of power were maintained, all Assyrian legacies. The Persians also inherited the model of the postal service, where the messenger changed horses to continue his journey. This was the forerunner of the modern postal system. In every hoofstep, there is an echo of the ancient Assyrian cavalry that raced day and night to deliver King Ashurbanipal's edicts to the northern frontier. After Persia came Rome, an empire that was not only great in territory but also in its ability to absorb and improve upon the legacy of the ancients. And if you look closely, you will see the breath of Assyria is still there, hidden deep in the limestone and marble of the Roman Empire. It is no coincidence that Rome revered military power, tight administrative organization, and great engineering. They learned from the Greeks, yes, but from the Assyrians, they inherited their belief in central authority, discipline, and total control through information. Look at the Royal Road, vi publice, the network of roads that crisscrossed Rome. It was like an upgrade of the Assyrian system that once connected Ashur to the Iranian border. With each step, the empire was shortened, its power extended. The Roman intelligence and spy system was also a sophisticated copy of the Assyrian royal messengers, who were depicted on reliefs with scrolls in their hands. The Romans called them frumentarii, men who not only delivered messages but also recorded the psychology of the people. An empire survived not only by its army, but also by its understanding and control of the emotions of the masses, something the Assyrians had done thousands of years before. Even in art, the Romans, despite their love of Greek beauty, were very fond of the Assyrian symbolism. Sculpture was not just for viewing, but for remembering and educating. Triumphal columns like Trajan's column in Rome, which depicts the entirety of a military campaign, were the Assyrian spirit, but with Roman marble technology. And if we go further, to the medieval Western empires, to the Renaissance, to modern administrative systems, we still see traces of the Assyrian mindset: meticulous record-keeping, hierarchical organization, the combination of force and symbolism, of violence and culture. Sometimes the greatest thing has no name. Like the roots of a tree, it is not present above ground, but it sustains the entire canopy of leaves that cover the sky. That was Assyria. After their empire collapsed, no one called themselves Assyrian. There was no successor state, no global religion, no universal symbol. And so their legacy was not confined to a specific form. It spread, dissolved, and entered the undercurrents of the world. Clay tablets buried in the ground for thousands of years now lie in the research labs of major universities. Scholars read cuneiform, the Assyrian cuneiform script, to trace the passage of time. They have discovered how the ancients calculated taxes, recorded censuses, wrote poems, recorded dreams, and told the stories of jealous, hot-tempered, and human gods. The amazing thing is, these things are not alien. Modern people see themselves in it. A love letter from a young man to a girl in Ashur, which still makes one blush when read. A record of a bad dream about thunder and snakes still makes one shiver, and lines of poetry written in clay, as if a 1,000-year-old heart were beating gently in the palm of one's hand. Today, management experts study the Assyrian state model to understand the principles of central control. Designers study Assyrian reliefs to find visual communication layouts. Poets read their epics to understand classical narrative structures. And the military, of course, study their tactics of siege, coercion, and psychological mastery. But the biggest lesson of all is the lesson that Assyria left behind. No empire is eternal, but memories, if recorded, can live forever. No cameras, no internet, no electronic cloud, the Assyrians wrote in clay. They do this because they understand one thing: words are magic, and storytelling is power. When you tell a story, you extend life. When you write, you give something back to the next person, whether it's a day from now or 3,000 years from now. And when you listen, as you are listening to this program, you are tapping into voices that have traveled through centuries, through fire, mud, and oblivion. You may never have set foot in an Assyrian city. You may not be able to read cuneiform, or know who Ashurbanipal was, or where Nineveh is on a map. But that doesn't matter. Because if you've ever used a map to manage, recorded data to make decisions, admired the organization and coordination of a system, you've lived the Assyrian mind. If you have ever looked at a painting and seen not just an image, but a powerful message, a purpose told in shapes, you are experiencing the Assyrian aesthetic. If you have ever dreamed and tried to rewrite your dream to understand yourself, you are following in an ancient tradition where Assyrian priests deciphered the spiritual through symbols. They not only believed in the visible world, but were pioneers in questioning the unconscious. The modern world thinks we have invented complexity. But no, the ancients were also sophisticated, skeptical, and built a whole universe of ideas to explain man and the universe. Assyria was not all war and stone. It was anxiety, the desire for domination and the fear of extinction. They were lonely. They were dreamers. They were afraid that time would wash it all away. And time did. But not completely. Because right now, as you listen to this story, as you close your eyes, picturing the stone road at Dur Sharukin, the silent Lamassu statues guarding the entrance, you are pulling Assyria back into the present. That is the magic of story. Story does not resurrect the past. It gives us a reason to listen. A sleep is not just a rest. Sometimes it is a journey, gentle and silent, through the ages. Assyria, with all that it was and lost, is no longer an empire. It is a whisper. A shadowy layer beneath every civilization, a part of you, whether you know it or not. Sleep well, traveler of time. Assyria is never dead. It is only waiting for you to hear the call. There are nights when the wind that blows through the land of Mesopotamia seems to carry the voice of the past. Not a loud voice, not the shout of an army or the cry of a vendor in the Nineveh market, but a whisper, as soft as a breath, that reaches the ears of those quiet enough to listen. It is the sound of cracked bricks in an old city wall. It is the rustle of weeds growing in the ruins of a ruined palace. It is an echo from beyond time, where the kings of Ashur have rested in the darkness of 1,000 years. If you have ever sat quietly in the ruins of an ancient city, you will know that feeling. The feeling that no one is speaking, but everything is telling you. The feeling that time does not pass, but only folds like a thin curtain. And you, even though you are a modern person, are still walking quietly beside the souls of the past. Assyria was once one of the most notorious empires. But in this moment, we are not talking about blood, war, or steel. No more majestic reliefs or resounding declarations from thrones. But what remains after all? Silence. A silence that is not empty, but full, not sad, but profound. As if all the pain, glory, defeat, and victory have passed. All have melted into the wind, into the earth, settled in the bed of the Tigris. In that silence, the Assyrian kings lie, not as rulers, but as storytellers. They no longer need titles. They no longer need power. The only thing they retain is their memory, written in clay, etched in stone, whispered in the dreams of us who come after them. The sleep of the Assyrian kings is not oblivion. It is a deep, quiet sleep, where the past does not disappear. It just recedes so that future generations can see it more clearly. You can imagine a moonlit night in the old land of Nineveh, where the wind gently pushes open the doors of chambers buried deep in sand and time. There is no sound of war horses, no sound of drums. There is only the breath of the earth and the echoes of ancient stories. It is where kings like Ashurnasirpal, Sargon, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, who once held the power of a world, now lie together, like travelers who have completed a long journey. No one is above the other. No thrones, no soldiers, no gods, just people and their stories. A strange thing happens when you tell a story to someone who is about to sleep. The voice slows down, the space shrinks, and the world becomes softer. We stop seeing Assyria as an empire and start feeling it as a soul that was once angry, once conquered, once burned like fire, but also tired, once broken, once tried to record it all on clay tablets so that nothing would be lost. Because deep down they knew, only memory is eternal. When you read an Assyrian inscription, you are not just looking at language. You are touching the hand of a craftsman who lived. You are hearing the whisper of a scribe whose hand trembles because he knows this line will outlive his house. And guess what? They were right. What remains is not the sword, not the citadel. It is the word, the written word, the retold word, the living word through your mouth. And now, through the whisper in the ear of the listener, somewhere in the world, right now, as they prepare to sleep. You can imagine a night in the palace of Dur-Sharrukin, where the torches have been extinguished for thousands of years. The vast corridors that once echoed with the footsteps of the guards are now dust and memory. The reliefs on the walls are still there, not intact, but still depicting a king on the hunt, a roaring lion, and a symbol of power, both ancient and distant. No one in that palace is alive anymore, but in the dreams of the night, under the pale moonlight, the palace comes alive, not in form, but in feeling. The feeling of an age when men believed they lived between two worlds, one earthly, the other divine. And both had laws. Both had punishments. Both had rewards. Assyria left the world not just monuments. It left a vision, a sharp look at truth, at power, and at the price of existence. Not a pessimistic view, but a mature view, that everything is temporary, even things that seem eternal. And so, sleep, for the kings of Ashur, is not the end. It is the sequel, the silence after the symphony, the moment when the story is no longer told in words, but in presence. You don't have to be a historian to feel it. You just have to be quiet and open your heart. Imagine, you are standing before the Lamassu statue. A gentle wind blows. The sky says nothing. The earth does not move. But you feel, clearly and deeply, that you are not alone. That someone is watching, not to judge, but simply to remind you. You are part of the story. Live as if. When you close your eyes at the end of the day, you can sometimes feel the world still spinning around the same old dreams. Not your own dreams, but the dreams of people who lived long before. They too dreamed of a great empire, of peace, of an immortal city. They too looked up at the stars and asked, "Will my name still ring when I am gone?" And they wrote, they carved, they built, not to fight time, but to whisper to it. They knew that time cannot be stopped, but it can be spoken to. And each line they left, each story, each image, was part of a conversation that lasted for millennia. Now, you are the listener, and if you choose to tell it, you become the speaker. That is how a civilization never dies. Assyria lives on, Not in maps, not in armies, but in memory, in art, in voices like this, slow, gentle, and sincere. And you, who are listening in the dead of night, are part of that life too. You have accompanied us through 25 chapters, from the source of the Tigris to the ashes of Nineveh, from the haughty triumphs to the lessons of collapse, from the flaming trumpets to the last whispers of the dead. Now, we need say no more. Just breathe, softly, like the wind on the stone steps, like the fine sand covering the relics. Good night, storyteller. Good night, listener. Good night, Assyria. And if one day you hear a voice from the east again, a faint call in the middle of the night, know that it is no hallucination. It is the whisper of kings who have slept. And they only want to remind you, history is never finished. It is just waiting for someone to listen. Sleep now with the kings of Ashur, and wake with the light of memory in your heart.